They called her Monster before they ever learned her name. Ran her out of 3 villages in 2 years. Torches, dogs, the whole pageant of human fear wearing the costume of righteousness. But here's what they never understood about a woman like Mirelle Thorne. Exile doesn't break the ones who were never truly belonging to begin with. It sharpens them. And now she stands before the most dangerous man in the known empire, red eyes steady, chin up, nothing left to lose, which makes her the most dangerous thing in that room. Stay until the end. You will not see this story coming. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from tonight. She had been walking for 11 days when the soldiers found her. Not the good kind of found. Not the stumbled upon, offered bread, here is shelter kind. The kind where 4 men on horseback come out of the tree line at a canter with their hands already on their sword hilts, and their eyes carrying that particular flatness that means the decision about you has already been made somewhere far above their pay grade. Mirelle did not run. Running was for people who still believed speed could outpace reputation. She stood in the middle of the King's Road, an actual road this time, cut stone and border markers, and the distant smell of a city that existed, and watched them circle her the way you circle something you're not entirely sure is dead yet. Her boots were held together by 3 separate lengths of salvaged cord. Her coat, once a deep charcoal gray, had been repaired so many times it was more patch than original fabric. Her hair was lank with road dust and 2 weeks of inadequate water. She looked, she knew, like exactly what she was, a woman the world had been chewing on for years and spitting out in pieces. But her eyes were steady. Her eyes were always steady. It was, she had decided, somewhere around the 2nd village, the one thing she would not surrender. They could take her shelter and her name and her right to exist in peace among decent people, but they could not reach inside her skull and soften what lived behind her gaze. The lead soldier pulled up 3 feet from her and stared down from his horse with the expression of a man who smells something uncertain. "You Mirelle Thorne?" he said. "Depends who's asking and what they plan to do about it." King's authority is asking, which means your plans don't factor in. She looked at the 4 of them, assessed. A habit so ingrained now it happened before conscious thought. Exits, weapons, the particular way the 3rd soldier kept his weight shifted left, which meant a bad knee. The fact that the 4th hadn't drawn at all, which meant either confidence or orders to take her breathing. "Then, yes," she said. "I'm Mirelle Thorne." The lead soldier nodded once, like she'd confirmed something unpleasant he'd been hoping was wrong. "By order of King Surath Draven, Alpha Sovereign of the Vareth Empire, you are commanded to present yourself before the throne. Resistance will be met with force." Mirelle looked past him at the city rising in the distance. Storm towers, black stone seawalls, banners of silver and blood snapping in the coastal wind. The capital of an empire that had been quietly expanding its edges for 30 years through a combination of military genius and the kind of ruthlessness that gets called policy in official histories. She'd been avoiding it for most of those 30 years. "Commanded," she said, "not requested." "That's correct. And if I'd been requested?" The soldier's jaw worked slightly. "You weren't." "No," she said. "I never am." She fell into step ahead of the horses without being told, because walking in front was better than being herded from behind, and the small dignities were the ones worth fighting for. They didn't chain her. That was the first interesting thing. Mirelle had been arrested before, twice in official capacity, 3 times in the more informal sense where a group of people decide collectively that your continued presence is a problem that direct physical force can solve. Every time, chains had been involved, iron manacles worn smooth by previous wrists, the particular humiliation of metal that declares to anyone who sees you exactly what category of person you've been sorted into. The king's soldiers rode around her in loose formation, swords still sheathed, and said nothing for the 3-hour journey into the city. She catalogued what she saw. Vareth was large, larger than she'd let herself believe from the outside, because believing in the scale of a thing meant acknowledging how much of it there was to be shut out from. The streets near the gate were wide and cobbled, lined with the kind of permanent merchant stalls that only exist where trade is regulated and violence against commerce is treated as a serious crime. People moved with purpose. The architecture was heavy, stone on stone, arches built to last centuries rather than decades. Nothing decorative that wasn't also structural. An empire that built like it planned to still be here. The people stared at her as she passed. She was used to staring, had been used to it since she was 14 years old, and the mark had manifested without warning or explanation, turning her eyes from the brown of her birth family to a deep arterial red that had no business existing in a human face. She'd watched her mother's expression change in real time, had seen love curdle into something that looked like love, but was actually the fear of what the neighbors would say. Her father hadn't even come in from the fields to look. He'd sent her brother out with a pack and the message that she should be gone before supper. That had been 21 years ago. The staring in Vareth streets had an edge she recognized. Not the open hostility of village superstition, but something more considered, more appraising. Word traveled faster than horses in cities. Whoever had sent soldiers to collect her had done it publicly enough that the streets knew something was coming before it arrived. The palace sat at the city's highest point, backed against the sea cliff. Up close, the black stone had a quality she hadn't expected. It wasn't uniform. There were older layers visible at the base, different stone from a different era, like the cliff itself had been built upon until the building and the cliff had become one thing. Neither entirely natural, nor entirely made. They brought her through a side entrance, not the grand approach. Another small dignity, this one the kind you got when someone wanted it, understood that your presence was a necessity, not an honor. The soldier who'd done all the talking stopped outside a set of ironwood doors and turned to look at her. "King Sarath doesn't," he started. "I know what kings don't," Mirel said. "I know what they do and don't, and what costs you if you get it wrong. You don't need to brief me. I've been alive in this empire longer than some of your junior men have been breathing." He held her gaze for a moment. Something shifted in it. Not respect exactly, but the precursor to respect, which was the recognition that what you were dealing with required more categories than the ones you came in with. "Don't reach for anything," he said. "Don't speak until spoken to. Don't look at the tree." She almost asked about the tree. She didn't. The doors opened. The throne room of King Sarath Draven was built to do one thing: remind you of your own insignificance with such architectural efficiency that by the time you reached the throne, your capacity for argument had been structurally undermined. Morel had spent years thinking about the ways power dressed itself. In villages, it wore the face of the elder with the most cows or the most sons. In towns, it wore property and the law that protected it. In courts and capitals, it wore stone and height, and the specific choreography of making you walk a very long way across a very large floor to reach a man who had been sitting down the entire time. She walked the length of it without slowing her pace. The court was present. 24 figures in various configurations of formal dress, arranged in the lateral spaces like decorative load-bearing columns. She felt their attention the way you feel a temperature change. Eyes cataloging the coat, the boots, the hair, the face. Landing on her eyes and staying there the way eyes always stayed there, with that quality of stuckness that meant the brain had hit something it didn't have a file for. King Sarath. Draven sat in a throne of black iron and pale stone, and he looked, she thought, exactly like a man who had been winning for too long. Not old, maybe 45. The kind of face that had probably been conventionally handsome in youth and had since been carved into something more severe by years of making decisions that had costs. A scar along his jaw, old and well-healed, running from the hinge to the chin, gray threading through black hair at the temples. Eyes that had the particular quality of absolute authority, which was not fierceness but steadiness. The look of a man who had not been surprised in years and had stopped expecting to be. He was looking at her the way she'd looked at the city, cataloging, assessing. Not with desire or disgust, but with the cold efficiency of someone who was deciding whether a variable was useful or a liability. Behind and to the right of the throne, something glittered in the peripheral vision with such insistence that she almost turned to look. The tree. She kept her eyes on the king. "Morel Thorn," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Not theatrical, not the booming declaration of a man performing authority, just level. The voice of a man who had learned that quiet required more attention than loud. "Yes," she said. "You were born in the village of Ashcroft. 21 years ago, removed for circumstances described in the provincial record as," he glanced down at something in his hand, "unnatural manifestation of unknown origin, possible harbinger of cursed fate, request for exile granted by village consensus. That's one way to describe throwing a 14-year-old girl out in the rain, she said. Someone in the court made a soft sound. Not quite a gasp. Not quite approval. Sarath's expression didn't change. Since that time, you have been connected to 8 further incidents of community disruption across 4 provinces. 2 accusations of theft. 1 of assault, later recanted. 1 of, he paused, livestock death by unnatural agency. That cow was already sick when I arrived. I tried to help it. That's the version that doesn't make it into provincial records. You have no fixed residence, no documented income, no family connections, and no registered status within any township in the Empire. Correct. Which means, Sarath said, that you are, legally speaking, a person to whom the Empire owes nothing. Also correct. And yet, he said, and here something shifted. Something small, barely visible, like a single cloud moving across a sky that had been entirely clear. You came. When my soldiers found you, you didn't run. You didn't fight. You walked here of your own volition, more or less, and now you're standing in my throne room with the posture of someone who thinks they have something worth saying. She held his gaze. I do have something worth saying. Then say it. Not yet, she said. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Several members of the court made sounds that were clearly involuntary. The lead soldier, somewhere behind her, had gone very still in the particular way of a man debating whether his life was about to get complicated. Sarath looked at her. She looked at Sarath. Before I say it, she said, I want to understand what you're actually offering in exchange for my walking through your doors. Because you sent soldiers to find me specifically. You had my record in your hand, which means someone compiled it, which means my name was on a list somewhere, and someone was paying attention to that list. You didn't pull a random cursed wanderer off a random road. You were looking for me, or someone like me, and you found me first. So before we get to what I know and what I can do, I want to know what you think I'm worth to you. Bam. Wickham. The court's silence had a different quality now. The appraising looks had shifted into something more uncertain, like people watching a chess movie they couldn't parse the reasoning behind. Sarath leaned back in his throne by perhaps half an inch. His hands, resting on the arms, didn't move. You're worth exactly as much as what you can deliver, he said, and nothing if you can't. Fine, Morel said. Then we understand each other. For the first time, something happened to Sarath's face that wasn't assessment. It was brief and quickly suppressed, but she saw it. The faint downward twitch at the corner of his mouth that was not quite displeasure and not quite something else. The face of a man who had just encountered, in a context he controlled entirely, something he hadn't predicted. He gestured to a figure at the edge of the court, and Morel was taken to a side chamber to be given food, water, and the broad strokes of the problem. The problem, as explained by a tired court physician named Aldrich, who smelled of vinegar and sleeplessness, was this. King Sarath had 6 sisters. Their names were Lyril, Seth, Yavane, Sorath, Min, and the youngest Erin, who was 15 years old and had celebrated her birthday 3 months ago in a palace where the celebration had not quite managed to conceal the fact that everyone at the table was scared. 6 weeks ago, they had begun wasting. The word the physician used was wasting, and he used it with the precise, controlled delivery of a professional man describing something that was defeating him. Each morning, the 6 princesses woke in their chambers with their silk slippers ruined, shredded, worn through, as though they'd been dancing all night on stone floors. Each morning, they were thinner. Each morning, their eyes carried the particular quality of people who have not slept despite having slept. Each morning, they were quieter, slower, the light in them dimming by increments so gradual that you could convince yourself nothing was changing if you looked away long enough, and then convince yourself of nothing else when you looked back. We've tried everything, Aldrich said. He said it the way men said things when they'd run out of options, and we're now in the stage where admitting it felt like the last thing left to admit. I've had colleagues in from the eastern provinces. We've restricted their diet, changed it, monitored it. We've had their chambers searched. We've had guards on their doors. The guards heard nothing, saw nothing. The doors were never opened. Morel had been eating a bowl of grain and salt pork that tasted to her road-worn palate like the finest thing she'd ever consumed. She kept eating. How long before they're beyond help? Aldrich was quiet for a moment. The youngest, Aaron, is deteriorating fastest. I estimate 3 weeks, perhaps 4. After that, the tissue loss will be... He stopped, restarted. She will not recover. And the hunters? The scholars? 3 hunters and a scholar from the university at Marais sent to investigate. 2 hunters returned. They reported reaching a passage beneath the palace and then losing all memory of what came after. They woke on the road outside the city with no idea how they'd arrived there. The 3rd hunter? Aldrich looked at the table. Did not return. She finished the grain, set down the bowl, looked at him straight. Why me? Specifically? I can't answer that. The king made that decision himself. But you have a guess. He was quiet again. The vinegar smell intensified slightly as he shifted in his seat. He was, she realized, not only exhausted, but frightened. Not of her. Something older and larger than her. The manifestations you've been connected to over the years, he said carefully. In 3 of the 8 incidents in your record, there were subsequent reports of anomalous phenomena resolving shortly after your departure. Things that had been wrong becoming less wrong. I think the king's people noticed that pattern. She sat with that for a moment. So he doesn't think I'm a monster, she said. He thinks I'm useful. He thinks both can be true, Aldrich said. That, she thought, was probably the most honest thing anyone in the Empire had said to her in 21 years. She was given a room, not a cell, an actual room, small and plain, but with a functioning lock she controlled from the inside, which she tested twice before she let herself exhale. A cot with a real mattress. A window that looked out over the inner courtyard. A pitcher of clean water and a basin and a change of clothes that fit well enough. Rough wool and plain linen. Nothing that announced status it wasn't owned. She sat on the edge of the cot for a long time without lying down. Her hands, resting on her knees, were rough-knuckled and scarred across the back from an incident with a fence in the 2nd year of her exile when she'd climbed it wrong and fast in the dark because there had been men with torches and she'd had perhaps 4 minutes of lead time on them. She'd carried the scars for 18 years now. They were, in her accounting, among the more honest things about her. She thought about what she was doing, not the mechanics of it, the investigation, the palace, the princesses. The mechanics would become clear or they wouldn't. She was good at mechanics. She had been surviving on mechanics and observation and the willingness to sleep in places that made your back ache for 21 years. She was not going to suddenly be incompetent at reading a room or following a trail. She thought about what she was doing in the larger sense, the reason she had not run when the soldiers appeared, the reason she had walked into this city and this throne room and this negotiation with nothing in her hands and a name that was documented shorthand for trouble. The truth of it was this. She was tired. Not tired in the body, though her body had its catalog of complaints. Tired in the specific way that comes from 21 years of existing in perpetual provisional status, where every day's safety was contingent on someone else's tolerance, and every night carried the low-grade awareness that tomorrow the tolerance might run out. She was tired of being allowed to stay until she was no longer allowed to stay. She was tired of the particular arithmetic of survival, where you added up your resources and your risks every morning and tried to make the numbers work one more time. She was, if she was being completely honest with herself in the dark of this small room in the middle of an empire that had not yet decided what to do with her, tired of having no leverage. This was leverage. Small leverage. 3 nights, the physician had said the king would give her. 3 nights to find an answer to something that had defeated trained hunters and provincial scholars. And at the end of it, if she succeeded, freedom. Documented, official, stamped and sealed freedom. A name cleared in the provincial records. The right to exist in the empire in the same legal sense that anyone else existed in it. She didn't let herself think about what happened if she failed. She was very good at not thinking about things she'd already factored in and set aside. She was brought to the king again at midday, and this time the court was smaller, a handful of senior advisors rather than the full display, which meant the conversation was real rather than performative, which she appreciated. Sarath was standing this time, near the tall windows that faced the sea, his back to the room, and he turned as she entered with the particular motion of a man who'd been genuinely occupied with something before her arrival rather than staged at the window for effect. She recalibrated him slightly upward. "You have questions," he said. "I have conditions," she said. Someone to Sarath's left, an older man with the look of a chief advisor, silver-haired and tired-mouthed, made a small sound of displeasure. Sarath lifted one hand without looking at him, and the sound stopped. "Say them," the king said. "I work alone. No escort, no guard assigned to watch me. No one reporting back to you on my movements inside the palace. I'm not going to find what your hunters missed with someone's eyes on my back." "That can be arranged. I have access to this princess's chambers and to the princesses themselves. Not briefings about them, not summaries, not a physician's interpretation. Direct. I need to hear them tell me what they remember and what they don't." "Also arranged. If I find the answer in 3 nights, you give me what the physician described. Written documentation, cleared record, right of residence. Not a favor I can be reminded of. Legal status." Sarath looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. "That is what was offered, yes. I want it stated clearly. Consider it stated clearly." He paused. Something in the pause. What else? She hadn't planned a 4th condition. She found herself saying it anyway. "If I find something that requires me to make a decision you haven't approved in advance, something outside the scope of what you sent your hunters for, I make it. I don't stop to ask. I don't lose time to protocol." This one he didn't answer immediately. The advisor to his left said, quietly, "That is, the king's authority cannot be pre-delegated to a—" "She's right," Sarath said. The advisor went quiet again. Sarath was looking at Morel with that assessment quality again, but different this time. Less cataloging, more like recognizing. "You've been in situations before where stopping to ask lost you the thing you were trying to save." "More than once," she said. "Then yes, you have it. Make the call if the call needs making." He turned back to the window, then turned back again, quickly, like something he'd held off saying was winning the internal argument. "The youngest, Erin. She's 15. She—" He stopped. Restarted. And in the restart, a crack appeared in the sovereign's architecture, something brief and human and painful. The face of someone who was also a brother and had been trying not to let that person be present in this room. "She still thinks this is solvable. She still believes me when I say we're working on it. I need that to remain true." Morel looked at him, saw the cost of the sentence. "I'll do everything I know how to do," she said. It wasn't a promise of success. He was smart enough to know that. He nodded once, and that was the end of the conversation. She spent the rest of the afternoon with the princesses. The eldest, Lirel, was 32, and she met Morel at the door of the shared sitting room with the posture of someone determined not to be categorized as a victim. Tall, dark-haired, a face that under different circumstances would have been striking, now hollowed by weeks of the slow theft happening to her body. She looked at Morel's eyes for exactly 1 second, noted them, and then deliberately did not look at them again, which was, in Morel's experience, one of the more sophisticated reactions a person could have. "You're the cursed woman," Lirel said. "Yes," Morel said. "Good," Lirel said. "The uncursed ones haven't been making much progress." The room held all 6 of them. Seth, 28, sitting very straight in a chair by the window, with the specific posture of a woman managing fear through discipline. Yavane, 25, who had the look of someone perpetually on the verge of saying something and perpetually deciding against it. Sorath, 22, who was asleep in the corner chair in the way of someone whose body had given up on staying awake, her chest rising and falling too slowly. Min, 18, standing near the fireplace and burning Morel with the unguarded hostility of someone young enough to still believe that anger could prevent bad things from happening. And Erin, 15, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her back against the wall and her hands loose in her lap, who looked up at Morel with eyes that were not afraid exactly, but were doing something harder than not being afraid. We're being present. We're choosing to be present even though presence meant feeling what was happening to her, because the alternative was to drift, and she was refusing to drift. Morel sat on the floor across from her. It was a deliberate choice. Something shifted in Erin's face. Tell me what you remember, Morel said. Not what you've told the doctors, what you actually remember. Erin looked at her for a moment. The music, she said. Lyral made a small sound from across the room. Min's jaw tightened. Tell me about the music, Morel said. It starts when I'm asleep, or I think I'm asleep. It's hard to tell because I feel awake. There's music that it doesn't sound like music anyone made. It sounds like music that just is, like the sound the world would make if the world were singing for itself. She paused. That sounds ridiculous. No, it doesn't, Morel said. What else? Water, Erin said. The smell of water that's very still, like a mirror. And then I'm somewhere. Where? Erin was quiet for a moment. Her hands in her lap had gone slightly rigid, the knuckles pale. Somewhere beautiful, she said. And I know it's wrong. I know while I'm there that something is wrong. But I can't. The wanting to leave part of me isn't working properly, like a door I can see but can't find the handle to. Do you remember anything about the way there? Passage? Steps? Stairs, Lyral said from her chair quietly. We've compared notes, stairs going down, through the floor of the wardrobe in the third chamber, but when we've looked in daylight, there are no stairs, just floorboards. How long have you known about the wardrobe? Since the third week, Seth said from her seat by the window. Her voice was controlled, but there was something else in it. Soreth was awake when it started one night. She saw herself walking toward the wardrobe. She couldn't stop herself. Soreth didn't stir in her chair. She's the worst, Min said from the fireplace. The anger in it barely covered what was under it. I know, Morel said. She looked at Min directly, and something about the directness, not softness, not pity, but the thing that was actually under her gaze, which was the recognition of someone who knew what it felt like to have everything going wrong with no way to stop it, made Min's jaw work once and then stop, the anger temporarily overtaken by something more unguarded. Can you fix it? Min said. It came out smaller than she'd intended. I don't know yet, Morel said, but I'm going to look. She stayed for 2 more hours, asked every question she had, built the picture piece by piece, the way she'd learned to build pictures when there was nothing but pieces. The music started at the same time each night, the 3rd hour after midnight. They never remembered waking. They always remembered arriving somewhere else. The somewhere else was consistent across all 6 of them: water, music, beauty, the wrong feeling, the inability to leave. The slippers ruined when they returned without memory of the returning. The thinning, the light leaving. By the time she left, the picture had a shape. She just didn't know what it was a picture of yet. She waited in her room until the palace was quiet. Real quiet. Not the performed quiet of a place with people still moving through it. The deep quiet that only arrived after the last lamps were banked and the night watch had settled into the rhythms of their routes. She had timed the rotation. She had been timing it all day with the peripheral awareness of someone who'd spent years navigating spaces where being seen in the wrong place at the wrong time had immediate and unpleasant consequences. At the 2nd hour after midnight, she moved. Through the corridor up 2 flights, through the passage to the royal wing that a sympathetic junior guard, with an honest face, had shown her that afternoon with the clear understanding that she was not supposed to use it after dark, but that the sympathetic junior guard had not been specifically told she couldn't. The distinctions in permission were something she'd become expert at, the gap between what was forbidden and what was merely not accounted for. The 3rd chamber's wardrobe was walnut, old, large enough to hang a dozen garments with room for 2 people to stand inside it. In daylight it had looked exactly like a wardrobe. In the deep of the 2nd hour after midnight, with the palace silent around her, she stood inside it with 1 candle and her hands spread against the back panel and felt. Not with her eyes. Her eyes were close to useless in low light at the best of times, with the thing that had no good name. The thing that had been present in her since the mark manifested, the sense that was not sight or sound or smell, but some combination of all 3 operating below the threshold of conscious perception, like water finding the level of things. She'd never been able to explain it to anyone's satisfaction, including her own. She just knew that when something was wrong with a place, she could feel the wrongness the way you felt a draft from a window that wasn't there. A directional cold that told you something was moving in a direction it shouldn't, The floor of the wardrobe was wrong, not visibly, not structurally, but underneath the wood, under the grain, and the age of it, there was something that pulled in a direction that was not quite down, a direction that didn't have a name in any geography she'd ever walked, like a compass pointing at a meaning rather than a location. She pressed harder. The wood didn't move. Of course it didn't. But the something underneath moved toward her, slightly, the way a tide moves toward a shore that is called to it, and for one full second she felt the edge of something enormous and old and utterly indifferent to her presence in the same way a lake is indifferent to the stone you drop into it. There and containing things and operating according to its own rules. Then it stopped. She stood in the dark of the wardrobe for a long time. When she came out, she sat on the floor of the chamber and thought. There was something below the palace, something that operated on a different schedule than the visible world, something that had a claim on the princesses that preceded her investigation by generations, maybe centuries, because whatever she'd felt in the floor of that wardrobe had the quality of ancient things, not freshly made, not recently installed, but settled into the bones of the ground the way water settles into stone, patient and permanent, and utterly at ease with its own permanence. She needed the third night's proper evidence. She needed to go down. She went back to her room, lay on the cot without sleeping, stared at the ceiling. She thought about Aaron saying the wanting to leave part of me isn't working properly. She thought about a door she could see but couldn't find the handle to. She thought about what kind of place you built to be so beautiful that the people inside it lost their will to leave. She thought about what kind of ruler built a place like that. And she thought about what she was going to do about it, which was the most important thought and the one that required the most honesty, because what she was going to do was go down into it alone with nothing but her own judgment and the thing in her that had no name, and either come back with answers or not come back at all. And she was doing it for documented legal status in an empire that had never once treated her like she belonged in it. That was the bargain. That was the only bargain available to her. She'd made worse. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. The second day she prepared. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical assembly of tools that belonged to stories. She had no special weapons, no inherited artifacts, no training from a secret order. She had the knife she always carried, and her own competence, and the willingness to pay attention to things that other people didn't notice. She'd survived on that combination for 21 years. It would have to be enough. She spent the morning in the palace's East Library, where the oldest records were, working through the sections on the history of the palace foundations with the focused efficiency of someone who knew how to read around what was being said toward what wasn't being said. Most histories of powerful places were histories of what the powerful wanted remembered. The real story lived in the gaps, the elisions, the references to events without explanation, the dates that didn't quite align with the official chronology. She found it in the margin of a survey record from 300 years ago. Someone, in handwriting so small she had to hold the page 6 inches from her face, had written, "The Eastern Foundation rests upon an agreement. Do not disturb the trees. The tree holds what was bound." 300 years ago. She looked across the library at nothing in particular and thought about the golden tree in the throne room, the one she hadn't been allowed to look at, the one that glittered in peripheral vision with such insistence that it took active effort to not look. She found a physician's record from 250 years ago describing 6 noble women of the ruling family found exhausted and silent each morning, thin-slippered, saying nothing of where they'd been. She found a hunter's report from 200 years ago, partial, the second half missing, that described a passage beneath the eastern wing and then stopped mid-sentence. Pattern. Clear pattern. 300 years of the same wound reopening. She thought, this is not new. This is the palace's inheritance. And then she thought, which means Sarath may not know what he's sitting on top of. She thought about that for a long time. When she returned to her room that afternoon, the lead soldier from her capture was waiting in the corridor outside it. He wasn't doing anything aggressive, just standing, but standing in a corridor outside someone's room is a communication. "He wants to know what you found," the soldier said. "He has until morning," Morel said. "I'll tell him at morning." "That's not—" "What's your name?" she said. He stopped. "Corin. Corin, I will tell the king what I've found when I have found it, which is morning. If he sends you back here before morning, I will tell him the same thing via you and waste time for all of us. If he wants it faster, he should have sent someone who understood how investigations worked. Corin looked at her. The same quality as the first day. Not respect yet, but the precursor. He's not a patient man, he said. No powerful man is, she said. It's a luxury they don't know they're missing. She went into her room and locked the door. But the second night she went down. The third hour after midnight. The wardrobe open, her hand on the back panel, the candle in her left hand because she needed her right hand free. And the candle was a liability and a necessity, and she was making the best decision available with the option she had. She pressed. The wrongness rose to meet her like a tide coming in, and this time she didn't pull back from it. Let it move through her. Let the sense that had no name orient on it, and follow it the way water follows the level, and the back panel of the wardrobe was no longer there. Not broken. Not opened. Simply not there in the way it had been there before. The stairs went down in a direction that was not quite down. The stone was black, but not the same black as Vareth's walls. A different texture and quality, smoother, almost reflective, like the stone had been poured rather than cut. Her candle cast shadows in wrong directions. She descended. At the bottom, and she could not have said how far down the bottom was, because the descent had a quality of duration that didn't correspond to the depth she should have covered given the number of steps she could count. There was a passage, and at the end of the passage there was light. Not candlelight, not fire. A quality of light that she did not have a comparison for, diffuse and sourceless, and deeply, fundamentally other. The way the word other means when you set it beside everything you've ever seen, and this is not any of those things. She stood at the end of the passage and looked at what was on the other side. Trees of crystal that caught the sourceless light and turned it into music. She could not have explained the equation by which light became music, but she understood it immediately. That here it was simply true. That in this place things operated according to laws she hadn't learned and hadn't been told. A sky of impossible violet and silver where stars moved with the deliberate slowness of things that knew they were being watched. A river that ran the color of polished mercury, with no visible source and no visible destination, moving through the landscape with the calm of something that had been moving since before the concept of time had been introduced to the world. And in the distance, across the Mercury River, lights. Pavilions, music, real music now, not the light-made kind, the kind human bodies made when they needed to move and had been told or compelled to move. Dancing shapes visible even at this distance, 6 of them. She stood at the threshold for a long time, felt the pull of it, not the wrongness she'd felt in the palace above, but something subtler, the quality of a place that wanted to be seen, that had been built, or perhaps had simply become, something that operated on the fundamental human desire to find somewhere that felt like arrival. She had been homeless for 21 years. She did not cross the threshold, not yet, because standing at the edge of it, with the crystal music and the impossible sky and the Mercury River lying before her like a question, she became aware that she was not alone. He was standing at the edge of the light, 10 feet inside the threshold, as though he had been there for some time. Not waiting. That wasn't quite the word. Present. Present in the way that a mountain is present, without urgency or effort, simply there with the full weight of its being. He was extraordinary. Not in the way that word is used as a synonym for attractive, though her visual assessment registered something she set aside immediately as irrelevant. Extraordinary in the literal sense, not ordinary. Not belonging to the categories of things she had reference for. Too composed. Too contained. The kind of face that had had centuries to practice stillness. Dark-robed, silver-crowned, with eyes that caught the sourceless light, and held it the way a deep lake holds a reflection, giving back the image but keeping the depth unreturned. He looked at her and she saw, for the first time in 21 years, something in another person's eyes that she recognized. He was not surprised to see her. He was not afraid of what he saw. He was looking at her red eyes with the expression of someone who had long ago ceased to sort anything into the categories of acceptable and unacceptable. "You came through," he said. His voice had the quality of his world, layered, other, carrying more than the words. "I followed the path," she said. "Others before you couldn't. Others before me turned back." A pause that had something moving inside it. "Yes," he said, "they did." She looked past him at the dancing figures in the distant pavilions, looked back at him. "I want to speak with them," she said. "Eventually," he said, "but first you came through the threshold. In this kingdom, that means you are my guest." He paused again, and the pause had an edge. "And my guests do not leave before I'm finished with them." She looked at him very steadily. "Who are you?" she said. Something moved behind his composed face. Something old and careful, and carrying more weather than any face she had ever read. "My name is Aurelian Vey," he said. "I am sovereign of this kingdom. And you?" He looked at her eyes, at the mark, at the face of a woman the mortal world had been rejecting for 21 years, are exactly who I was hoping would come through that door. The Mercury River flowed, the crystal trees sang, and somewhere in the pavilions, 6 princesses danced without stopping, their bodies growing lighter by the hour, their slippers wearing through, while the sovereign of an impossible kingdom looked at the cursed woman from the world above with eyes that held centuries of waiting and said nothing more. Only waited, with all the patience of a ruler who has learned that the things worth having are worth the time it takes to catch them. Above her, through stone and foundation and history, the golden tree in Serath's throne room stood in the dark, untouched, waiting to be understood. And Morel Thorne, who had survived everything the mortal world had found to throw at her, stood at the edge of a realm outside the mortal world entirely, and understood for the first time that she had just walked into something she had not fully prepared for. Not the kingdom, not the sovereign, the way he was looking at her, like she was the only variable in an equation that had been waiting 300 years for its answer. She did not step back. That was the first decision, and it mattered more than anything that followed, because the first decision in a room with a sovereign, any sovereign, mortal or otherwise, sets the grammar for everything that comes after. Step back, and you've already told them what you are. Hold ground, and you've told them something else. Morel Thorne had been holding ground since she was 14 years old, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the red mark in her eyes. And she was not about to renegotiate that particular contract now. Not here. Not with this man looking at her like she was the answer to a question she hadn't been told was being asked. "Exactly who you were hoping for," she said. "That's an interesting thing to say to a stranger." Aurelian Vey did not move, did not shift, did not adjust, did not perform any of the small recalibrations that people make when they've said something more revealing than intended. He simply stood at the edge of the light with his dark robes perfectly still in air that had no wind, and looked at her with those deep lake eyes that gave back the surface and kept everything else. "You came through the threshold," he said again, "without the music pulling you, without the compulsion that brought the others. You chose the passage." "I followed a trail," she said. "I'm here for the 6 women dancing in those pavilions. I want to see them." "You will," he said, "but not tonight." "That's not your decision." "In my kingdom," he said very quietly, "everything is my decision." The quality of the statement was not aggressive. That was the unsettling thing. Men who needed to assert authority with volume did it because they weren't certain the authority would hold without reinforcement. This was different. This was the calm of a man who had been sovereign so long that dominion had stopped being a performance and become simply the texture of how he moved through the world. She understood the danger of that immediately. Not the danger of violence. She'd been reading physical threats for 21 years, and she didn't feel that here. Not yet. The danger of a different kind. The kind that doesn't grab you, but waits, perfectly patient, for you to decide the waiting is worse. "What do you want from me?" she said. Something shifted in his face. Small. "An honest question," he said. "Finally." "I've been asking honest questions since I walked in." "You've been assessing," he said, "which is not the same thing. You've been watching my exits, reading my posture, calculating the distance between here and the threshold." A pause. "You're very good at it, but it isn't the same as asking." She held his gaze. "Fine. What do you want from me?" He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet the crystal trees sang their light-made music, and the Mercury River moved its purposeless course, and somewhere distant the 6 princesses danced in their slow imprisonment. He looked at her the way you look at something you've been waiting for so long that the arrival of it requires a moment of adjustment, like a man who'd been holding a door against wind for 300 years, and suddenly the wind had stopped. "I want to talk," he said. Whatever she'd been braced for, it wasn't that. Talk, she said. You came through a threshold that has defeated every person I've drawn toward it for 2 centuries. You came through alone without weapons beyond a knife, and whatever it is you carry in you that doesn't have a name. You stood at the edge of this kingdom and you looked at it without wanting to possess it or run from it, which is rarer than you might think. He looked at her eyes, and this time didn't look away from them, held the red of them with the steadiness of someone who had long ago exhausted his capacity for flinching at things the mortal world called wrong. I want to talk to someone who can do that. Is that so difficult to understand? It was, she thought, a very particular kind of answer, the kind that was true and incomplete at the same time, a thing a ruler learns to say when the fuller truth would cost more than the moment is prepared to bear. I'm not staying past dawn, she said. I'm not asking you to. Tonight. He turned slightly and gestured toward the river, a motion that managed to be both an invitation and a direction without quite being either. Walk with me. She didn't follow him immediately, stayed 1 breath, 2, long enough to establish that the following was her choice. Then she followed. This is worth understanding about power and the people who've survived its edges for long enough. The instinct to establish autonomy, to claim the decision, to be the one who moved first, is not stubbornness. It is the scar tissue of every time the choice was taken without asking. Morel Thorne had not walked behind anyone in 21 years without first being certain that the walking was her own act. It was the kind of habit that looks like defiance from the outside and feels from the inside like breathing. They walked along the bank of the Mercury River in the impossible twilight of Noctir, and neither of them spoke for a full minute, which was also a kind of conversation. The 6 women, she said finally. Tell me about the agreement. It predates me, he said. That's not an evasion. The bargain was struck by a ruler of Noctir 3 centuries before my sovereignty. A king of Vareth, who wanted power he wasn't born with, came down the same passage you used tonight and offered a trade. The bloodline of his house, in tribute, 6 daughters of each generation, their vitality given as tithe, in exchange for 30 years of military invincibility. She thought about the survey record, the margin annotation, 300 years ago. He agreed to that for 30 years, she said. 30 years felt like forever to a man facing war on 3 fronts, Aurelion said. There was something dry in it, not quite contempt, more like the exhaustion of having watched the same calculation be made and regretted in every generation. Men who are desperate bargain with their descendants' lives because their descendants aren't present to refuse. And the agreement has run itself forward ever since. It cannot be broken from within this kingdom, only from without, only by someone of the mortal world who comes down voluntarily and presents a case for severance. He paused. I have been unable to tell anyone that. She looked at him. Unable? The terms of the original bargain included a clause prohibiting direct confession of the arrangement's terms to any party from the mortal world. I cannot stand in front of a king's messenger and say your sisters are being drained by a contract your ancestor made. The words don't form. Something crossed his face that was the sovereign's version of anger, tight and controlled and very old. I am confined to inference, to the hope that someone sharp enough comes through who can see the shape of the thing without being told it directly. The Mercury River moved beside them. Crystal trees sang. Morel walked and thought and felt the shape of it, fitting into the shape she'd been building from library margins and physicians' records, and a 15-year-old girl saying the wanting to leave part of me isn't working. How long have you been waiting for that person? She said. The pause before his answer was long enough to carry a century in it. Long enough that I had stopped expecting it would happen in any particular generation, he said. I had begun to think the bloodline would simply run out before someone came through who could... He stopped. Who could what? He looked at her sideways, and in the look was something that was not the sovereign. Was something older than the sovereign, something that had been present before the crown and would be present after it, the raw matter of a person that no amount of authority can fully dress. Who could do anything about it, he said, and who I would want to explain it to. She filed that away without reacting to it. Filed it in the same place she'd filed the way he'd looked at her at the threshold. She was very good at filing things in places where they couldn't affect her immediate judgment. The trials, she said, the ones hunters who came before me were offered. He was quiet. I read a hunter's report, she said. Partial. From 2 centuries ago. It mentioned trials. The clause that prevents direct confession allows for an alternative mechanism, he said. 3 trials structured to reveal the truth of the arrangement through direct experience rather than direct statement. Complete them, and the contract's terms become clear to the mortal participant without me having to speak them. And the ones who failed. Another long pause. The river moved. The trees sang. The terms of failure are at the winner's discretion, he said carefully. She stopped walking. He stopped a step ahead of her and turned. The winner being you, she said. Yes. And the ones who failed the trials, where are they? She watched something move across his face, watched him make a decision about it, watched him, for the first time since she'd come through the threshold, look away from her briefly, toward the tree line, in the particular direction of something he didn't want her to see yet. They're still in my kingdom, he said. Still, she said this word back at him with the full weight of what it meant. As what? As they chose to remain, he said, which is not quite the same as what you're thinking. Then tell me what I'm thinking and explain why it's wrong. He turned back and faced her, and the face he was facing her with was the most unguarded she'd seen it. Not open. He was not, she thought, a man who did open, possibly had not been a man who did open in so long that open had stopped being a mode available to him, but less armored. The particular exposure of someone who is explaining something they are not proud of to someone whose opinion of it matters in a way they hadn't accounted for. The hunters who came before you were not adequate to the trials, he said. They encountered the first trial and failed. The terms of failure, as I stated, are at the winner's discretion. I chose to make them part of this kingdom. She waited. They are housed in the grove, he said, preserved, conscious, comfortable, within their particular limits, not suffering. A pause that had cost in it. I was, at the time, less interested in mercy than in the alternative, which was releasing them to return and report to the mortal world and watch another generation pass without a resolution. So you kept them because it was convenient, she said. I kept them because I was running out of options and patience and the willingness to keep watching this arrangement continue without end. The tightness in his voice, not anger at her, anger at the thing, the ancient thing, the 300-year inheritance of someone else's desperate bargain. That does not make it the right decision. The admission landed in the air between them and stayed there. She looked at him for a long time. Read the face, read the stance, the hands, the way the sovereign's posture was present, but the thing underneath it was speaking in a different register entirely. Assessing, yes, but also understanding. She was very good at reading the places where people had run out of good choices and had started making the least bad ones instead, because she had been living in that territory herself for most of her adult life. How many? She said. 7, he said, over 2 centuries. 7 people preserved in a grove because a sovereign had been desperate and alone and unable to ask for what he needed directly. She thought about the shape of that, not because it excused anything, it didn't, but because she'd been studying survival long enough to know what it looked like from every angle, including the one where the person surviving had done damage in the process. The greatest prisons are rarely built from iron. Sometimes they are built from the accumulated decisions of someone who started by protecting themselves and didn't know how to stop. You're going to free them, she said. It was not a question. Something moved across his face. If you complete the trials, he said, the terms of the arrangement will be clear to you, clear enough that you can argue severance. If severance is granted, and it is not certain the original contract has standing, I will have no further leverage to hold them. That's not what I said, Morel said. I said you're going to free them, before the trials. As a precondition, the silence was sharp. You're in my kingdom, he said. Very quiet. I know where I am, she said. And I know what I'm asking. You want someone to complete the trials and argue severance. I'm the first person in 2 centuries who's come through voluntarily. You said it yourself. You were waiting for someone you'd want to explain it to. That means you need me specifically, not just someone, which gives me something to bargain with. He looked at her and she looked at him, And between them the Mercury River moved, and the kingdom breathed in its impossible way, and 300 years of accumulated weight pressed on both sides of the conversation from every direction. "You bargain in my kingdom," he said, "the way you bargained in Serath's throne room." "I bargain the way I've survived," she said, "with what I have, which is currently the fact that I'm the first viable option you've had in a very long time, and we both know it." Another silence. Longer. Something happening inside it that she couldn't fully read, which was unusual and worth noting. "The Grove is accessible tomorrow," he said finally. "I will take you there. You will speak with them, and then you will decide if you trust the trials." "And if I decide I don't?" "Then you leave at dawn and I continue waiting," he said, "and the princesses continue as they are." She recognized the honesty of it. He could have added threat to that sentence, could have implied that her departure would cost her something, could have leaned on the power differential in a dozen ways. He didn't. He stated it plainly, the stakes and the choice, and let it sit. She had met exactly 2 people in her life who stated things plainly without using the plainness as a weapon. She was looking at the second one now, which was strange given what he'd admitted to doing with 7 people over 2 centuries, strange and complicated, and something she filed away with all the other things. "Dawn," she said. "Dawn," he agreed. She turned and walked back toward the passage. She did not look back. But she heard him, just before the threshold swallowed her, make a sound that was not quite a breath and not quite a word, something at the very edge of language, the sound of someone standing alone in a large space after the one interesting thing in it has left. She carried it with her back up through the stone. Above, the palace was still. She sat in her room until real dawn, and then went to the king. Serath was already awake. She suspected he had not slept, that the lead soldier Corin had reported her movements, and Serath had spent the night in the specific vigil of a ruler who has handed agency to someone else, and is discovering how little he likes it. He was at the window when they brought her in, watching the sea, the quality of a man who had been at the window all night. He turned when she entered. "Well," he said. "I found the passage," she said. "I went through." Something tightened in his face. "And my sisters. They were there, alive, still themselves." She watched relief cross his face and be immediately replaced by the question he needed to ask. "Not permanently damaged, as far as I can tell." "Not yet, as far as you can tell. I'm being honest with you." He was quiet a moment, absorbing it. "What is it?" he said. "What's down there?" She told him the shape of it. Not everything. Not the grove, not the 7 people preserved in it, not the specific texture of the conversation with Aurelion that she was still processing herself. The structure. An ancient arrangement. A 3-century inheritance. A claim on the bloodline of Vareth's ruling house that had been accumulating compound interest for 300 years. She watched his face while she told him. Srath Draven had the face of a man who had been running an empire for 15 years and had believed, because the empire ran well and the borders held and the citizens were governed effectively, that he understood what he was sitting on top of. She watched that belief revise itself in real time. The particular recalibration of a sovereign, discovering that the ground beneath the ground has its own history and its own agreements, and does not particularly care about the ones he thought he'd inherited. 300 years, he said. Your ancestor made the bargain. I know which ancestor, he said, flat, heavy. The one the histories call a military genius. A pause with something ugly in it. He bought 30 years of victories with his descendants' bodies. Yes. Sarath turned back to the window. His hands on the sill were very still, which she was learning meant the opposite of stillness inside. What do you need to break it? Trials, she said. I have to go back down and complete 3 trials. After that I can argue severance. And if you fail the trials, she held his gaze. I won't. That's not an answer to what I asked. No, she said. It isn't. She held it 1 beat longer. If I fail, the kingdom down there keeps me, permanently. That's the stated cost of failure. Sarath stared at her. And you're telling me this because I told you I would tell you what I found, and I meant it, and because I need you to not send anyone else down that passage while I'm in it. Not soldiers, not hunters, nothing. Anyone who goes through while I'm working the trials complicates the terms in ways I can't predict, and potentially puts the princesses at greater risk. He was quiet for a long moment. The sea outside threw itself against the black stone cliffs with the same patience it had been throwing itself against them for centuries, indifferent to the empires built on top of it. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "to trust someone the province records ascribe as a cursed exile, with no attachments, no status, and no reason to come back up." "I'm telling you to trust the bargain we made," she said, "which is all either of us has." Another silence. She thought about Aaron sitting cross-legged on the floor, choosing to stay present when drifting would have been easier. She thought about the survey margin note and the hunter's missing second half and 7 people in a grove who had been down there for varying amounts of what passed for time in a kingdom beneath the palace floor. "You have something at stake," Sarath said. "The documented status. Your name in the provincial records." "Yes." "That's what's bringing you back." She looked at him. Read the question behind the question, which was not about the documented status at all, but about whether she was the kind of person whose word was the thing it presented as. A king who had been purchasing loyalty and managing betrayal for 15 years had learned to look for the actual load-bearing element of a person's reliability, the thing that would hold when everything else failed. "That's part of it," she said. "What's the other part?" She thought about Aaron saying the wanting to leave part of me isn't working properly. "A 15-year-old girl," she said, "who is choosing to stay awake in a situation that is happening to her without her consent, and who still believes her brother when he says they're working on it. That's the other part." Sarath held her gaze for a long moment. "Go," he said. "Do what you need to do." She turned to leave. "Thorn," he said. She stopped. He was looking at the sea again, not at her, which was the only way he could say what came next. "I know what the province records say about you. I know what the village reports say. I've read all of it." A pause. "I also know what the pattern in those records says if you read it differently. Every place something was wrong and then became less wrong after you left. Every incident that in retrospect looks like someone trying to help in a situation where helping wasn't welcome." He stopped, started again. "You have been paying for a face you didn't ask for, and a mark you didn't choose for 21 years. The documentation I offered, it's a partial payment on a debt this empire didn't know it owed." She stood with her back to him for a moment. "I'll settle for the documentation," she said. She left. Gotch. The second descent was different from the first. Not the passage. The passage was the same black stone in wrong direction and sourceless depth. But she was different in it, carrying more now than the knife and the unnamed sense and the years of survival mechanics. She was carrying the weight of what she'd learned and the shape of what was coming and the particular gravity of a person who has committed to a thing and is now in the part where the commitment is real. Aurelion was waiting at the bottom. Not at the threshold this time. A slight distance back from it, which was a small thing and which she registered as significant. Space. He had given her space on the approach. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "The grove," she said. He turned and led her. The path went through the crystal trees on a route she couldn't have found alone, and as they walked, the trees singing adjusted around their movement in a way that felt less like music and more like attention. Like the kingdom itself was tracking the walk, filing it. She thought about what it meant to be sovereign of a place like this, to be the center of a living landscape that responded to your presence, that was tuned to you after centuries of you being the only constant in it. The loneliness of that had a specific shape, not the loneliness of exile, which she knew from the inside. Different. The loneliness of being everything to a place that was nothing to a world above. The grove was exactly what she'd feared it was. 7 golden trees, each one different in its detail, but unified in the quality of their wrongness, the quality that said, "This is not the way trees grow." Each one bearing in its bark the impression of a face. Eyes closed, not sleeping. Preserved was the word he'd used, and it was the right word, suspended between the last moment and the next, held in amber of impossible gold. She stood in front of each of them and looked. 2 women, 5 men, various ages. The oldest impression she could read with the least amount of certainty. The bark had grown a little over the features, time doing what time does. The most recent clear and sharp, a man with a hunter's jaw, and the lines of someone who'd spent years looking at distance. She turned to Aurelian. He was standing back from her again, watching her look at what he'd done. "Did they choose this?" she said. "No," he said. "They failed the trial, and I chose it for them." No hedge on it, no qualification. The particular honesty of a man who had been alone with what he'd done long enough that defending it had stopped being an available option. "Do they know where they are?" "I believe so," he said. "The awareness does not fully cease. It rests." She looked at the hunter's face in the most recent tree, the jaw, the distance lines. "How long has this one been here?" she said. 40 years. She thought about 40 years of resting awareness in a golden tree in a kingdom beneath the palace floor. Thought about it the way you think about things you can't fix, which is to look at them directly and not look away. "When the severance happens," she said, "they come out. If the severance succeeds, the mechanism holding them ceases to function." "Yes." "You could have released them before," she said. It was not quite an accusation. "At any point, they're here because you chose." "Yes," he said. "Why didn't you?" The silence was longer than any of the previous ones. The grove was quiet in a way that felt like held breath. He stood with his hands at his sides and his sovereign's face in front of him like armor he couldn't quite decide to put down. "Because releasing them felt like admitting the trials were not going to produce what I needed," he said, "and I had not yet arrived at the point of admitting that." He paused. "I'm aware of how that sounds." "It sounds like someone who had been waiting so long they couldn't afford to stop waiting," she said, "even when waiting was costing other people." He looked at her. "I'm not forgiving it," she said. "I'm reading it. There's a difference." Something happened behind his eyes, small and deep, like a stone dropped into the lake dark. "Most people don't bother with the difference," he said. "Most people haven't survived long enough to need to," she said. She looked at the grove for another long moment, and then turned away from it, back toward the crystal trees and the Mercury River and the distant pavilions. "Start the trials," she said. He was very still behind her. "Now?" he said. "You said you'd been waiting 2 centuries for someone to come through and complete them. I'm here. I'm not delaying it. Start the trials." She heard him move, heard the sound of his steps, different from mortal steps in a way she couldn't have described, like they carried more deliberate weight. Felt him come to stand beside her rather than behind her, at her left, at the same height. "The first trial is truth," he said. "And Noctur truth has physical force. You will be shown a memory. Not yours, not mine. A reconstruction of the original bargain, the original negotiation 300 years ago between the King of Vareth and the Sovereign of Noctur. You will watch it, and at the end you must state aloud, without flinching, what you believe to be the actual nature of the agreement. Not the stated terms, the actual nature." "What's the risk?" "Truth stated inaccurately and Noctur collapses," he said. "The collapse reflects back on the speaker. Define reflects back." "Pain," he said simply, "proportional to the degree of inaccuracy. The more you soften or distort the truth of what you see, the more it costs you to say it." She thought about that. "So the trial rewards honesty," she said. "It demands it," he said. Rewards is too gentle a word." She looked at the silver sky with its slowly moving stars, took a breath of air that tasted like something a little to the left of the mortal world's air, a little more present to itself. Felt the unnamed sense in her orient on what was coming with the quality of something that had been waiting for an appropriate challenge. "All right," she said. And Noctur arranged itself. The trees fell back. The river stilled. The pavilion lights in the distance dimmed, and in the space that opened around them, the air thickened and changed, and the 300 years that had brought her here began to unspool, the original bargain taking shape in the space between one breath and the next. A desperate king, a different sovereign, and the particular exchange made between a man who needed victory and a kingdom that had learned to collect what desperate men were willing to offer. She watched all of it. She did not look away from any of it. And when it was over, she stated aloud clearly, without softening a syllable of it, exactly what she had seen. The truth stood in the air of Noctur like a stone pillar, solid and irreversible. And in the grove behind her, 7 golden trees trembled for the first time in decades. Aurelian looked at her with the expression of a man who had been correct about something for 2 centuries and had just been proven right in a way that cost him something unexpected, not the being right, but what the being right meant. He had found her. He had been looking for 200 years, and she had arrived, clear-eyed and rough-edged and carrying 21 years of honest reckoning in every line of her face, and she had looked at the worst of the truth and said it plainly without flinching. She turned to face him. 2 more, she said. He looked at her with those centuries-deep eyes, and what lived in them now had no name in the mortal world's vocabulary, and perhaps no name in his own, something that had been sleeping for a very long time and had just opened its eyes. 2 more, he said. And in the pavilions, the 6 princesses danced on, not knowing that the woman who had come to free them had just passed the point from which, in ways neither she nor the sovereign of Nocther had yet admitted aloud, there was no longer any road that led to a simple ending. The second trial came without ceremony, no grand announcement, no theatrical staging. One moment Morel was standing in the aftermath of the first trial with the truth still resonating in the air of Nocthyr like a struck bell that hadn't finished ringing, and the next moment the landscape shifted around her with the casual totality of a place that operated according to its own logic and did not require her consent to do so. The crystal trees were gone. The Mercury River was gone. In their place, a room. Not a room from Nocthyr, a room from the mortal world, and her body knew it before her mind caught up. The quality of the air, the specific weight of it, the smell of tallow candles and damp stone, and the particular staleness of a space that had been lived in by frightened people for a long time. The room was bare except for a table and 2 chairs and a single candle throwing orange light across surfaces that had nothing to offer it back. She was sitting in one of the chairs. Across from her was a woman she had never seen and knew immediately. The face had Serath's jaw. Had the bone structure of the ruling line carried forward across generations, softened into feminine angles, but unmistakably the same origin. She was maybe 30, dressed in the travel-worn clothes of someone who had been on a road for weeks, and her eyes were the same quality as Serath's, the steadiness of someone who had not been surprised in a long time. Except where Serath's steadiness came from authority, this woman's came from something that had been forged out of surviving the removal of everything she'd thought was solid. She looked at Morel across the table. "You're the cursed woman," she said. The echo of Lirel's greeting hit Morel in the chest, and she absorbed it without showing it. "Apparently," she said. "He's going to use you," the woman said. "That's what he does. That's all he's ever done with the ones who come through. He finds what they need and he uses it as the door. And then when he's done, he keeps them." Morel looked at her, looked at the room, looked at the quality of the trial she was in, which she was still mapping. "Who are you?" she said. "My name doesn't matter," the woman said. "I'm the warning you didn't get before you went through. I came down 40 years ago. I had my reasons. I thought I was strong enough. I thought wanting the right things would be enough protection." A pause. "The tree in the grove with the hunter's face, that's mine." The candle between them threw shadows in 2 directions. Morel sat with the information. 40 years. The hunter's jaw. The distance lines. She had read that face in the grove and assigned it male because she'd been looking at it too quickly, and now she recalibrated and understood she'd been wrong and understood more than that. That the kingdom had shown her exactly what it wanted her to see in exactly the order it wanted her to see it. "You're part of the trial," she said. "Everything here is part of a trial," the woman said. "That's not the same as being false. I'm real. What I'm telling you is real. The fact that it's being used as a test of something doesn't make the content of it a lie." This, Morel thought, was the particular sophistication of the second trial. The first had demanded honesty about something external, observable, 3 centuries old and emotionally distant. The second was demanding something harder, honesty about something present, proximate, and designed to cost her. "Tell me what you came down for," Morel said. The woman looked at her for a moment. "The same arrangement as you, the same bloodline claim. I was the family's hunter, not Vareth's house, a different branch of it, distant cousins. Our women were wasting. I came down to find the answer, a pause that had the particular weight of an old grief that had stopped being sharp only because it had been present for so long. I found the answer. I passed the first trial. And then he told me about the grove, and I asked him directly, why keep them? Why not just release them and wait for someone who could complete all three? And he said, She stopped. What did he say? Morel said. He said he'd forgotten how, the woman said. He said he'd been alone in this kingdom for so long, ruling something that answered to him but never pushed back, never disagreed, never needed anything from him that he hadn't already decided to give, that he'd forgotten the mechanism by which you let something go. She looked at her hands on the table, and I felt sorry for him, which is exactly what he needed me to feel. Because the moment I felt sorry for him, instead of staying focused on what I'd come for, I stopped being a problem he needed to solve and started being a resource he could use. Morel looked at her. Read the face. Read the grief in it, the specific grief of someone who had understood something too late and had been living in the understanding ever since. The second trial, Morel said. What is it asking me to decide? Whether you believe me, the woman said, whether you walk out of this room and treat him differently, whether you let the warning change your approach. She paused. Or whether you decide that what you've seen of him so far is real, and my warning is the manipulation, the trial trying to break your trust before you can complete it. The candle burned between them. This was the impossible architecture of genuine trials, not the ones that tested strength or cleverness, but the ones that tested the capacity to hold two truths at once and not collapse the tension prematurely into a comfortable single answer. The woman in front of her was real, and her warning was real. Aurélien Vey had kept 7 people in golden trees for 2 centuries, and that was also real. And the conversation at the river and the grove and the first trial's honesty had also been real. The capacity for damage and the capacity for genuine reckoning could exist in the same person. She knew this. She had built her entire survival on knowing this, because the alternative was to treat every person who'd ever hurt her as purely one thing, and that kind of certainty was a comfort she'd never been able to afford. I believe you, Morel said, and I'm going to complete the trials. The woman looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in her face. Not disappointment, not vindication, something more complicated. Why? She said. Because 6 women are in those pavilions getting thinner by the hour, Morel said. And because believing your warning doesn't mean I think the trials can't be completed. It means I go into them with my eyes open instead of shut. She held the woman's gaze. And because you've been in that tree for 40 years, and I am not leaving you in it. Silence. The candle threw its shadows. The woman said very quietly, He'll offer you something in the third trial, something real, something he actually means. That's the part that breaks people, not the manipulation, the sincerity. I know, Morel said. The room dissolved. She was back in Nocthur, standing beside the Mercury River, and Aurélien was 3 feet away watching her with the expression of someone who had seen what she'd just gone through and was waiting with the careful patience of someone who understood that what came next depended entirely on what the last few minutes had done to her. She looked at him. The woman in the grove, she said. She came 40 years ago. She was a hunter for a branch of the Verith bloodline. Something flickered behind his eyes. Yes. She passed the first trial. Yes. Why didn't she pass the second? He was quiet for a moment. The quality of a man standing in front of a question that has been waiting for him specifically for a very long time. She felt sorry for me, he said. And I accepted the sympathy. I should not have. In Nocthur, sympathy offered to the sovereign functions differently than it does in the mortal world. It creates an obligation, a binding. She didn't know that, and I didn't tell her. Because telling her would have broken the clause. Because telling her would have broken the clause, he confirmed. Flat. No modification of it. Or because you were lonely, Morel said. His jaw tightened slightly. Both things can be true. Yes, she said. They can. I'm aware of that. I just said it out loud so we're both clear that I'm aware of it. He looked at her with the deep lake eyes and the centuries behind them, and something in his face that was not quite pain but was the kind of pressure that exists at significant depth. You passed the second trial, he said. Yes, she said. The second trial breaks most people, he said, not through difficulty, through doubt. The doubt that you've been managed, that everything you've experienced here has been staged, that the only rational response is to stop trusting your own perception. I know what the second trial was, she said. It was asking whether I could hold two truths at once without choosing the comfortable one. He was quiet for a moment. And what were the two truths? That you are capable of serious damage, she said, and that what I've seen of you in the last 2 nights is also real. Both things, simultaneously, without resolving them into one clean verdict. He stood with that for a long time. The kingdom breathed around them, silver and violet and sourceless, its crystal trees singing their light-made music into the air of a place that had been waiting for this specific conversation for longer than most mortal empires had existed. The third trial, she said, show me. It was not what she expected. She had been, without fully acknowledging it to herself, expecting something with a physical component, something to outwit or outmaneuver, a labyrinth or a test of endurance, or something that mapped to the kind of competence she'd been developing for 21 years. What she got instead was a room that appeared first as a hallway and resolved into a space that had no clear geometry, its walls reflecting back her own image from angles that shouldn't have been possible, and in the center of it, a single question written in the air in letters that burned silver cold. What do you want? Not what does the contract require? Not what do the princesses need? Not what did you bargain for in the throne room above? What do you want? She looked at it for a long time. This is the cruelest kind of trial, because it is not testing what you can do, but what you will admit to yourself in a place where the admission has weight. Most people spend their entire lives developing sophisticated systems for not answering this question directly, for routing the answer through what they're supposed to want, or what it's safe to want, or what they've been told they're permitted to want, given the category of person they are. The woman who's been exiled and marked and refused and run out of 3 villages in 2 years does not, as a general operating principle, answer the question, what do you want with the full honest inventory of the thing? She answers it with what's achievable, what's safe, what costs the least to admit. The room waited. The silver letters burned. Morel stood in front of them and understood that the answer that would pass the trial was the true answer. And the true answer was not the documented legal status. The documented legal status was what she'd bargained for, and it was real and important, and she was not giving it up. But it was not the answer to this question in this room. The true answer was this. She wanted to exist somewhere she wasn't provisional. She wanted to not be the thing that got tolerated until tolerance ran out. She wanted to matter to something, a person, a place, a moment, in a way that wasn't contingent on performing harmlessness. She wanted someone to look at the red mark in her eyes and see her, and not what the mark meant to them. She said it out loud, all of it. The room didn't transform, didn't collapse, or bloom, or produce a dramatic response. It simply became quiet in a way that felt like an earned quiet, the particular silence of a place that has received what it was waiting for and has no remaining argument. She walked back out into Nocther. Aurelion was waiting exactly where she'd left him. He looked at her face, and something in his own face changed. You passed, he said. Not triumphant, not relieved. The voice of someone who had been holding something very carefully for a very long time and can now set it down, and isn't sure yet what to do with hands that are empty. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. I heard it, he said. In Nocther, the trials are not private. I heard what you said. She had known that, had known it and said it anyway, which was itself the completion of something. Then you know, she said. Yes, he said. I know. They stood on either side of the space where it had been said, and everything between them was different now. Not in the dramatic way of stories, but in the quiet way of realities that have shifted a degree or two on their axis, a change small enough to measure only against what it will mean over distance. The grove, she said. Now. Now, he agreed. Up. The 7 trees released their occupants the way water releases something it's been holding when the vessel is broken. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, but with the simple inevitability of a thing that has been under pressure being relieved of it. The golden bark dissolved from the outside in, and the 7 people inside came back to themselves in stages, the awareness returning before the motion returning before the full understanding of how much time had passed. Morel stood among them while they recovered themselves on the grove floor. The woman from the second trial sat up and looked at her with an expression that was too complicated for one word. 4 decades of preserved suspension, and now the sudden, sharp re-engagement of a body with the concept of its own presence. Her hands were shaking, and she was looking at them with the expression of someone relearning that hands were hers to move. 40 years, Morel said quietly. 40 years, the woman confirmed. Her voice was rough, unused, the particular roughness of something restored rather than broken. Are the princesses? Not yet, Morel said. But now I argue severance. That comes next. She turned to Aurelian. He was standing at the edge of the grove, watching the 7 people come back to themselves on the ground, and his face had the expression of someone who had just done something that could not be undone and was finding out how that felt. Not regret. She didn't read regret. Something more honest than regret, which is the confrontation with what you actually are when the long-maintained version of yourself is no longer the only available story. Severance, she said. He nodded once. The mechanism requires you to state the nature of the original arrangement, in full, in the ceremonial space. The contract then has the opportunity to respond. If your argument holds, if what you've stated is accurate and the grounds for severance are legitimate, the arrangement ends. And if the contract argues back, contracts of this age have standing, he said. They can contest. The contestation takes the form of an alternative offer, something the contract believes you would accept instead of severance. She looked at him. What kind of alternative? His eyes held hers for a moment with the quality of a man delivering information he has been required to deliver and would have chosen not to. The contract is a reflection of the original king's desire, he said. His desire was power. Specifically, belonging, the invincibility that comes from being unchallengeable. The contract will offer you a version of that. It will offer you exactly what you said you want in the trial. The silence that followed had weight. It heard the third trial too, she said. Everything in Noctur is interconnected, he said. The contract is part of Noctur. She understood what he was telling her. The trial's honesty, which had felt like a liberation, had also been a disclosure. The contract now knew exactly where she was vulnerable, exactly what to offer. It would offer her belonging, permanence, the end of provisional existence. In Noctur, with all the power and splendor and otherness of this kingdom as the frame. And it would mean the princesses stayed. The arrangement continued. The tithe kept running. You could have warned me, she said. I couldn't, he said. The clause. The clause prevented you from telling me the contract heard the third trial. Yes. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and looked at the 7 people recovering on the grove floor and thought about Aaron on the palace floor above choosing to stay present. Thought about what it had cost the woman with the hunter's face to spend 40 years in gold bark because she'd felt sorry for a man who was genuinely worth feeling sorry for and had not known the feeling would trap her. Power's most devastating weapon is not force, but the ability to offer what the vulnerable most need, precisely when they're most open to receiving it. A desperate king bargaining with his descendants' lives because victory felt more real than the future's cost. A sovereign of an impossible kingdom, keeping people in trees because releasing them meant admitting the wait had been fruitless. The woman in the grove, snared by sympathy. The architecture was always the same. Find the hunger and feed it just enough to make the cage comfortable. Morel had been hungry for 21 years. She knew hunger's face from the inside. Take me to the ceremonial space, she said. The contract's response came the moment she finished stating the nature of the original arrangement. She had stated it completely and accurately, the way the first trial had prepared her to. Every clause and condition, and the 3 centuries of compound exploitation running forward from a desperate ancestor's choice. The ceremonial space, a circle of silver stone at the heart of Noctur, older than anything else there, older than Aurelian's sovereignty, had received the statement and gone quiet. Then the alternative offer appeared. It didn't speak. It showed. She saw herself in Noctur, not as a captive, not as a guest, as a sovereign. Beside Aurelian, with the kingdom acknowledging her the way it acknowledged him, the crystal trees singing in a key that included her. A place where her red eyes were not wrong, where the mark was not a curse, but a feature of someone who had always belonged somewhere other than where she'd been put. A throne built on 300 years of accumulated power. Partnership in the truest possible sense. A man who had waited 2 centuries and would have waited 2 more for this specific outcome. The vision was not a lie. That was the brutal part. That was the part the woman in the grove had told her was coming, and she'd said, "I know," and she had not fully known. The contract's offer was not false. It was showing her a genuine possible future, one that existed and was available, and that Aurelian would agree to with a sincerity that had nothing of manipulation in it. The contract was not inventing the offer. It was showing her the truth of what Aurelian Vey wanted, laid bare by 300 years of waiting, and using his genuine desire as the mechanism of her snaring. She saw Aaron, not in the vision, in her own mind, placed there by her own will, the 15-year-old girl choosing to stay present in a situation happening to her without consent, still believing her brother when he said they were working on it. She saw the 6 women in the pavilions, dancing without memory of dancing. She saw the 7 people on the grove floor, 40 years and 2 centuries between them, working out what their own hands felt like. And she looked at the vision of herself beside Aurelian in the Silver Kingdom, and she understood, with the kind of clarity that only arrives after you've been honest in a place that demands it, that the reason she could not accept the offer had nothing to do with whether she wanted it. She wanted it. She was not going to pretend she didn't. The trial had already taken that pretense off the table. She wanted it the way you want something that would cost someone else the thing they most need, which is the specific shape of desire that requires you to become a different kind of person to accept. The kind of person who decides that their own belonging is worth more than 6 women's freedom and 40 years of another woman's life and a 15-year-old's belief that the people above her are working on it. She had been many things in 21 years of exile. She was not going to become that. Severance, she said, into the silver circle, with every ounce of the hard-won honesty she had built year by year from the ruins of everything she'd been denied. I argue severance. The arrangement was struck without the consent of the line it bound. 3 centuries of tribute have exceeded any reasonable measure of the original exchange. The claim is exhausted. The arrangement ends. The contract considered. The silver stone hummed. And then it broke. Not violently, not with a dramatic fracture or a concussive force. It broke the way old agreements break when the truth of their injustice has been fully stated by someone who means every word, quietly, with the particular finality of something that has been held in place by nothing but the accumulated momentum of its own history finally running out. The hum stopped. The circle was just stone. In the pavilions, the music ceased. She heard, at the very edge of perception, 6 women stopping mid-movement as the compulsion that had been moving them released its grip, the sudden silence of a machine going still after 300 years of continuous operation. She stood in the circle and breathed. Behind her, Aurelian had not moved. She turned to face him. His face was... She looked at it and could not find the word that fit it entirely. Not devastated, not relieved. The face of a man who has just had the thing he most wanted and the thing he most needed occur simultaneously, and in a way that cost them both, and is standing in the aftermath of that, finding out what it means to be on the other side of the waiting. "The princesses," she said. "Free," he said. "The arrangement's end releases them. They'll wake in their chambers." He paused. "It also ends the mechanism holding the passage open." She looked at him. "The passage," she said, "between here and above." "Closed," he said. "The arrangement was the anchor that kept it open. Without the arrangement..." He stopped. She understood. The passage was closed. She was in Nocthir with no road back to the mortal world, the 6 princesses freed in their chambers above, and the king's bargain with her technically fulfilled from below without her being present to collect on it. And the man in front of her had known this was a possible outcome and had not told her because the clause had prevented it, and because some part of him, the part she was choosing not to make simple, had wanted to see what she would choose if the choice was real. The woman from the second trial was somewhere behind her in the grove, 40 years later, watching this. Morel looked at Aurelian Vey, sovereign of the Starborn Court, who had kept people in trees and waited centuries and been alone in an impossible kingdom, until it had shaped him into something that no longer knew how to want things without also wanting to keep them, and who was looking back at her now, with his centuries and his damage and his genuine reckoning all present at once in his face. "Tell me there's another way out," she said. He held her gaze. "There is," he said, "but it requires something I cannot compel." something that has to be given freely. And now that the arrangement is severed, I have no leverage to ask for it. Ask anyway, she said. He was quiet for a very long time. The kingdom breathed around them, older than empires, older than the agreements that had shaped it, a place that had been many things over the centuries and was now being asked to become something it had not been before. Stay, he said. Not as captive, not as tribute, not as the answer to something I needed, as a choice. He looked at her with those lake-dark eyes and the full weight of what he actually was, powerful and damaged and capable of serious harm and genuinely reaching for something better than what he'd been. Stay, because Noctur has been mine alone for 300 years, and that has made me into exactly the kind of ruler who puts people in trees and calls it necessity. Stay because the trials showed me someone who can hold two truths at once without choosing comfort. Stay because I am, and here his voice dropped below the sovereign entirely and landed in the place where the person had been living all along, waiting for exactly this, asking. Morel Thorne, who had been exiled at 14 and had survived on mechanics and observation, and the willingness to not look away from things that cost something to see clearly, stood in the ceremonial circle of a kingdom beneath the palace of an empire that had never once treated her like she belonged in it, and looked at a sovereign who was asking and meaning it. Above her, through 300 years of stone and agreement and history now severed, the golden tree in Serath's throne room stood in the first light of morning, waiting, holding what it had held for 3 centuries. And Morel understood, with the full force of the only real revelation that matters, not the ones that arrive quietly, but the ones that arrive as a demand, as the moment the last wall comes down and the choice is exposed in its bare and irreducible form, that she was no longer the person who had walked into Serath's throne room 2 nights ago with nothing but the bargain. The bargain had been completed. The princesses were free. The documented status, the cleared name, the right of legal residence in an empire that had owed her 21 years of debt, all of it was sitting above her in a throne room she might never see again, fulfilled and uncollectible. And she was standing in the oldest kingdom she had ever encountered, being asked a question by the only person who had ever looked at her red eyes and kept looking. And the answer she gave in the next 30 seconds was going to be the truest thing she had ever said, because there was no leverage left, no bargain left, nothing left to survive toward. Only the question, bare and enormous, of who she was going to be when there was nothing forcing her to be anything at all. She opened her mouth. She said, "Show me the other way out first." Aurelion went still. Not the sovereign stillness, the performed composure of a man who had learned centuries ago that motion was information and stillness was power. This was different. This was the stillness of someone who had just made the most honest request of their very long life and received, in return, not an answer, but a condition, and was now standing inside the condition trying to determine whether it was a rejection dressed as negotiation or something harder and more real. "Why?" he said.
But it's also shown.
"Because I need to know the door exists before I decide whether to walk through it," she said. "That's not a refusal. That's me being exactly as honest as your kingdom spent 3 trials demanding I be." He looked at her for a long moment, the lake-dark eyes doing their work, reading her the way she read rooms and exits and the specific body language of people making decisions they haven't announced yet. Then he turned and walked. She followed. The path he took went deeper into Noctur than she'd been before, past the grove where the 7 freed people were still gathering themselves from the ground, past a stand of trees whose crystal had gone deep blue rather than clear, singing in frequencies she felt in her back teeth rather than heard. The landscape thickened around them, became more present, more itself, the way places become when you move from their edges toward their center. At the heart of it was a door, not metaphorical. A literal door standing freestanding in a clearing of silver grass, made of something that looked like compressed starlight, and had the quality of an object that had been waiting for a very specific person for a very specific length of time. No frame, no wall, just the door, in the middle of the clearing, with a handle worn smooth by hands that had never touched it. "That goes up," Aurelion said, "directly to the mortal world, not to the palace, somewhere outside the city walls, near the coast road." He paused. "It opens from this side, closes permanently behind whoever uses it. She looked at it. Permanent. One direction. No return passage for the person who walked through. She looked back at him. "You've had this the whole time," she said. "Yes." "Why didn't you use it?" The question was not rhetorical, and he knew it. He stood in the clearing with the freestanding door at his back and looked at her with the expression of a man who has arrived, after a very long journey by a very indirect route, at the place where the only thing left is the full truth of himself. "Because using it meant leaving," he said, "and leaving meant—" He stopped. "Nocthir is mine. I built what it is. 300 years of shaping a kingdom that responds to me, that carries my decisions in every crystal tree and mercury current. I am this place in the way that a person is their own body. Walking through that door meant walking out of myself." She held his gaze. "And now, he said, someone severed an arrangement that has been running for 300 years and freed 7 people I had been preserving because I lacked the courage to release them, and passed 3 trials that 2 centuries of candidates could not complete, and is standing in my clearing asking the right questions." Bumps. A pause that had the full weight of what it contained. Now the kingdom I built to protect myself from needing anything has just become the thing standing between me and the only person I have encountered in 300 years who I actually want to need. The silver grass moved in air that had no wind. The door stood between them and the mortal world, permanent and one-directional and patient. Morel looked at it. She thought about this coast road outside the city walls. She thought about the documented status sitting in Serath's throne room, fulfilled and waiting. She thought about a 14-year-old girl sent out into the rain with a pack and a message that she should be gone before supper. 21 years of provisional existence. Every day's safety contingent. Every belonging temporary. Every place she'd tried to make her own, eventually made impossible by the red mark and the rumor and the arithmetic of human fear. She thought about the question the 3rd trial had asked, and the answer she'd given in the silver circle, and the fact that it was still true now, here, with the door in front of her and the choice bare and enormous and belonging to nobody but herself. She turned away from the door. "I need to go above," she said. "Not through that door, back the way I came. The passage closed, but there has to be another mechanism. The tree in Serath's throne room. I saw the margin note. The tree holds what was bound. If the arrangement is severed, what it held should be releasable." Aurelion's expression shifted. Something moved through it quickly. "Morel, you said the clause prevented you from telling me the contract heard the 3rd trial," she said. "You said it prevented direct confession of the arrangement's terms, but the arrangement is severed now. The clause is severed with it." His jaw tightened slightly. "Tell me about the tree," she said. A long silence. "The original bargain included a secondary binding," he said, slowly, with the quality of a man speaking words that have been locked inside him for 3 centuries and are now coming out one at a time like stones being removed from a wall. "As collateral. The first sovereign of Nocthir was not trusted by the Varith king to honor the arrangement from a distance. So the sovereign was bound into the tree, as guarantee of performance. A projection of himself remained here to administrate the arrangement. His physical self was imprisoned in the gold. "I troposomite." She stared at him. "You," she said. "Yes. You have been partially imprisoned in that tree for 300 years. The projection that speaks to you is real," he said. "This is genuinely me. But the complete weight of what I am, is in the bark of that tree in Serath's throne room, 300 years of it, compressed into gold and cut off from everything except the management of an arrangement I did not make and could not end." The clearing was very quiet. This was the thing beneath the thing beneath the thing. The arrangement had imprisoned the princesses. The clause had imprisoned Aurelion's capacity to ask for help directly. And under both of those, the original collateral binding had imprisoned the sovereign himself, split him for 300 years between the projection and the prison. Between the man who walked the Mercury River and the man locked in the gold, and the severance she had argued had broken the arrangement, but not necessarily the secondary binding, because the secondary binding was a different instrument entirely. "The tree," she said, "in the throne room. Serath was told not to look at it. The binding fractures under direct sustained attention from someone of the bloodline, given willingly," Aurelion said. "The original king didn't want it broken. He wanted his guarantee to remain in place. He told his successors it was dangerous to look at. The prohibition became tradition. And if sunlight hits it, she said. She was thinking of the ceiling in the throne room, the quality of the architecture, the way the vaulted heights were built with panels that could open. She'd noted it without knowing why. Something crossed his face. How do you know that? I don't, she said. I'm reasoning from what I've seen. The tree is gold. And Nocturne truth has physical force. Sunlight is... She thought about the crystal trees and the light-made music and the way illumination functioned in this kingdom, not as mere physics, but as something that carried meaning. Sunlight is the most honest light there is. It doesn't choose what it shows. Aurelion looked at her. 300 years in the bark of a tree in a throne room he'd never seen, administrating an arrangement through a projection of himself while the mortal world built empires above him and changed kings and forgot what lived in their foundations. She was reading the cost of it in his face now, in the way the sovereign's composure had something exhausted beneath it, that she'd been reading since the first night without knowing its full source. The things that imprison us longest are rarely the ones applied by enemies. They are the ones agreed to in moments of desperation, by people who thought the cost was manageable, that became the shape of everything after. If the ceiling opens, she said, and sunlight hits the tree, the secondary binding breaks, he said. The gold dissolves. What's been compressed there for 3 centuries comes back to... He stopped. I don't know what I become when the projection and the original are reunited. I've been split for 300 years. I don't know if the seam holds. She looked at him. Is that a risk you're willing to take? He held her gaze. You would go above, he said, to Serath's throne room, to argue a case for opening the ceiling to a king who has no particular reason to trust your judgment about what happens when his decorative tree dissolves. After 2 nights below the palace, with the 6 princesses restored but no other demonstration of anything. Yes, she said. For me, he said. For the completion of a thing that should have been completed 3 centuries ago, she said. And yes, for you. The silver grass moved. The freestanding door stood patient in the clearing. There's a passage, he said finally. Not the original. An older one from before the arrangement. It goes up through the eastern foundation. It opens in the palace garden near the seawall. He paused. It's been sealed for 2 centuries. I can open it from this side. Do it, she said. He looked at her for one long moment. You said show me the door first, he said. You've seen it. I'm asking. I know what you're asking, she said. And the answer is the same thing I said before, which is that I need to finish this first. Whatever I decide about staying or not staying, I am not leaving an unfinished thing behind me. That's not who I am. She held his gaze. You know that. The trials showed you that. His jaw worked slightly. East Passage, he said. 3rd foundation stone from the seawall. I'll open it now. She turned toward the direction he indicated. Mirelle, he said. She stopped. The reunion of the projection and the original, he said. And here his voice dropped entirely below the sovereign, below the centuries, below the composure and the damage and the architecture of a person who had been protecting himself for 300 years from the need to say vulnerable things plainly. I have been partial for so long, I do not know what whole looks like. I am telling you that honestly. I do not know what comes out of that tree when the gold dissolves. She turned to look at him. I know, she said. I'm going anyway. She left him standing in the clearing with the door to the mortal world behind him and the kingdom breathing around him, and she moved through Nocturne for the last time at a pace that was not quite running, but was everything she had. Chet. The East Passage was exactly where he'd said, and it was exactly as old as it felt. Rough stone and dry air, and the smell of 2 centuries of sealed dark that rushed out past her when the stone shifted inward and cold coastal wind came rushing back in its place, salt and spray, and the particular dawn quality of air that has been moving across open water. She came up into a palace garden that was gray with early light, the sea visible over the seawall, the sky in the east going from deep violet to a thin, hard line of gold at the horizon. She ran. Through the garden, through the servants' entrance at the east wing, up 2 flights, through the corridor, past Corin, who materialized from the far end of the hall with his hand on his sword and his eyes going wide. The king, she said without stopping. Throne room, now. Corin fell into step behind her without asking, which she filed away as a mark in his favor. The throne room doors were closed. She pushed them open. The room was empty of court, early enough that the day's business hadn't populated it yet. Sarath was there. She'd been right that he didn't sleep, that he'd been present and waiting in the building anxiety of a man who had given agency to someone else and could not stop monitoring the door the agency had walked out of. He was standing near the window with a cup of something that had gone cold, and he turned when she entered with the full sharp attention of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. Behind him, the golden tree glittered in the early gray light with its infuriating peripheral insistence. "My sisters," he said. "Free," she said. "In their chambers, the arrangement is severed." She was breathing hard from the run, not hiding it. "I need the ceiling open, the panels above the throne. Now." Sarath looked at her. "Why?" "The tree is a prison," she said. "Whatever you were told about it, whatever your family's tradition says about looking at it or touching it, it is a prison, 300 years old. The person inside it is the reason the arrangement has been manageable rather than catastrophic, and the arrangement is over, and I need sunlight on the bark." Sarath stared at her. This is the moment that reveals the truth of any leader. Not the battles they plan for, but the seconds when someone they have cautiously extended trust to stands in front of them with a request that has no framework, no precedent, no safety net of established protocol, and asks them to act on nothing but the quality of what they've seen so far. A king who has been ruling through control and calculation for 15 years feels the request as a physical thing, a hand around the throat of every instinct that has kept him alive and in power. "You're asking me to open my throne room ceiling based on 2 nights and a story I can't verify," he said. "Yes," she said. "And if you're wrong, then you have a throne room with an open ceiling and a tree that didn't dissolve, and I owe you an apology and a better explanation." She held his gaze. "I'm not wrong." "How do you know?" "Because I've been in the place where that tree is anchored, and I spoke to the person inside it, and he is—" She stopped, the full weight of the sentence pressing on her from behind. "He has been waiting for 300 years for someone to come along who would argue the thing correctly, and I argued it, and the arrangement is broken, and the only piece left unfinished is the man compressed inside that gold, and I am asking you to trust me." Sarath looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Corin, who was standing in the doorway. "Open the ceiling," he said. Corin moved. The mechanism was old, but maintained. Sarath's builders were thorough people, and the panels above the throne responded to the chain pulls in the eastern alcove with the heavy groan of machinery that had been waiting for its purpose. They swung outward on their hinges, each panel larger than a man, and the dawn light came through in sheets, gold and cold, and absolutely honest, the kind of light that shows everything exactly as it is. It hit the tree. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the gold began to move. Not melt. Move. The way bark moves in a high wind, except the movement was inward. The surface of it contracting and shifting as 300 years of compression began to release, and the throne room filled with a light that was not the dawn's light, but something older and more deliberate, sourceless, the way Noctur's light was sourceless. The projection of an entire kingdom's worth of power decompressing into the available space. Sarath took a step back. His cup hit the floor. Morel did not step back. She stood 12 feet from the tree and watched the gold dissolve and thought about what Aurelion had said. "I do not know what comes out of that tree when the gold dissolves," and thought about the 7 people on the grove floor relearning what their own hands felt like, and thought about 300 years of partial existence, split between projection and prison, administrating someone else's arrangement in a kingdom that responded to you but couldn't reach you where you actually were. The gold was almost gone. The light was blinding. Sarath was against the far wall, one hand on the stone, not running but not moving forward, the face of a king encountering something genuinely outside his categories. And Morel was standing 12 feet away with her rough-knuckled hands at her sides, and her road-worn coat and her red eyes open and steady, watching the most powerful thing she had ever seen come apart and come together at the same time, watching 300 years of compression release into a single moment of becoming, and somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the focus and the assessment and the survival mechanics that never fully went off, A small and honest voice noting that she had no idea what she was going to say when the light cleared, only that she would not look away from it, only that she would see it exactly as it was. The gold dissolved, the light reached its apex, and in the space where the tree had stood for 300 years, something began to emerge from the brilliance. Not the projection she had spoken with in Noctir, not the composed sovereign with the dark robes and the centuries behind his eyes, but something fuller and more present and considerably more overwhelming. The reunion of everything he had been split into, landing in the throne room of an empire that had been built on top of his imprisonment with all the weight that 300 years of compression could produce. The light hit its peak. Serath grabbed the edge of the window frame with both hands. Morel's feet found purchase on the stone floor, her weight forward, her eyes fully open. The shape in the light turned toward her, and the gold finished dissolving, and the light began to clear, and the throne room of the Vareth Empire held its breath. The light took a long time to clear, too, not because of any physical property of light, but because of what the light was carrying. 300 years of compressed sovereignty, releasing into a space that had been built for mortal ceremony and was now being asked to contain something considerably larger than that. The throne room's stone absorbed it the way old stone absorbs everything, without comment, without resistance, by simple virtue of having been present long enough that very little surprised it anymore. Morel did not shield her eyes. This was not bravery in the conventional sense. It was the same thing that had kept her feet from stepping back at the threshold of Noctir, the same thing that had kept her chin up in every village square and every provincial hearing where the decision about her had already been made before she opened her mouth. The refusal to look away was not a performance of courage. It was the only thing she had ever fully owned, the one possession that exile and rumor and 21 years of provisional existence had never managed to take from her. She looked at what came out of the gold. He was taller than the projection had suggested. That was the first thing. Not dramatically taller, but the difference between a representation of a person and the full weight of the person inhabiting every inch of themselves. The dark robes were the same, but carried differently now, not draped over a projection, but worn by a body that had just been reunited with 3 centuries of itself and was still in the process of understanding what that meant. His hands were at his sides, and they were not entirely still. A faint tremor, barely visible, the physical evidence of a system under significant load. His face was the face she knew, and more than the face she knew. The lake-dark eyes were the same, but the depth in them was different, fuller, the way a body of water looks different when you can see the actual bottom, rather than the implied one. 300 years of being split between projection and prison, administrating an arrangement from one side of a divide while the original self waited in compressed gold on the other. The reunion of those two halves was not clean. She could see it wasn't clean. There was something raw in his face that the projection had never carried, something unfinished, a wound in the process of being assessed, rather than a wound in the process of being hidden. Serath had not moved from the wall. His hand was still on the stone, the cup still on the floor where it had fallen, and he was looking at the thing that had emerged from his throne room's decorative tree with the expression of a king who had just discovered that the foundations of his empire included a person, and was now doing the very fast and very uncomfortable arithmetic of what that meant for every assumption he'd built on top of it. Aurelian looked at Serath. The quality of the look was not aggressive. It was not the look that precedes a demand or a threat. It was the look of 2 sovereigns in the same room for the first time, each carrying the full weight of what they were. And the first order of business was the simple and unavoidable establishment of what that meant. Serath pushed off from the wall. He was, she had noted from the first day, not a small man in any sense. Not physically, not in presence, not in the specific gravity that 15 years of running an empire had built around him. He crossed the throne room floor with the deliberate pace of a man who understood that the speed at which you approach something tells the room what you think of yourself relative to it, and he stopped 8 feet from Aurelian and looked at him with those steady, unsurprised eyes. "My sisters are free," Serath said. "Yes," Aurelian said. His voice was different from the projection's voice in the same way his face was different, fuller, carrying more resonance, as though the reunion had restored registers that had been absent. "The arrangement is severed. The claim on your bloodline ends with this generation and does not carry forward. The arrangement your predecessor made with mine." Yes, Serath was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face that she had learned to read. The sovereign managing the person, The person having feelings the sovereign couldn't afford to display in full. 300 years, he said. My family has been paying tribute to something under our floors for 300 years, and the histories called it a military legacy. Your ancestor preferred that framing, Aurelion said. I was in no position to argue it. The dry quality of it, the 300 years of enforced silence finding its first outlet in something that was not quite bitter and not quite amused but carried both as undertones, landed in the room, and Serath absorbed it, and the king's jaw worked once in the way that meant he was deciding how much anger was useful and how much was simply accurate. You could have told someone, Serath said. I could not, Aurelion said. The binding clause prevented direct confession to anyone for 3 centuries. Serath looked at Morel. She found it, he said. It was not quite a question. She argued the severance, Aurelion said, without being told what to argue or how to argue it. She read the shape of the thing from margin notes and physicians' records and a 15-year-old girl's description of not being able to find the handle of a door. A pause. Your empire has been sitting on top of a significant injustice for 300 years, Serath Draven. The injustice is ended. What you do with the knowledge of it is your arithmetic to run. Serath held Aurelion's gaze for a long moment. Power recognizes power. This is one of the few genuine axioms of sovereign existence. Not because powerful people are especially perceptive, but because the quality of weight that authority produces in a person has a specific signature, and those who carry it are attuned to its presence in others the way musicians are attuned to pitch. Serath had been in rooms with warlords and ambassadors, and the various grades of human danger that an empire's edge produces, and he had learned to read the register of all of them. He had never been in a room with something 300 years old. He made the adjustment with the visible effort of a man who is accustomed to being the fixed point in any room and has just discovered the room has a different fixed point today, and he made it without flinching, which was, Morel thought, the most honest demonstration of actual leadership she had seen in 15 years of watching Serath's court from a distance. The woman I bargained with, Serath said. He was looking at Morel now, and his voice had shifted out of the sovereign register entirely into something more direct and less performed. She held her end. She held more than her end, Aurelion said. Then I hold mine. Serath turned to the eastern alcove. Corin appeared from the alcove where he had been standing with the rigid stillness of a professional who has decided that the least dangerous thing he can do right now is be very quiet and very present and hope nobody addresses him directly. The documentation we prepared, Serath said. Bring it. Corin disappeared and returned quickly with a sealed document, official weight and official wax, the specific gravity of a piece of paper that the Empire had decided was real. He handed it to Serath, who crossed the room and held it out to Morel. She looked at it. 21 years of being the thing that got tolerated until tolerance ran out, and here was the paper that said otherwise, held out by a king in a room that still smelled of dissolved gold and 300-year-old compressed sovereignty and the cold salt air coming through the open ceiling panels. She took it. The wax was still warm from wherever Corin had been keeping it. She held it in her rough-knuckled hands and felt the weight of it, and did not perform any feeling about it. Did not let relief or gratitude or the 21-year hunger for exactly this translate into anything visible, because she was not yet in a place where she could afford to let go of the composure that had carried her through, and she knew herself well enough to know that if she started, she would not be able to stop. And there were still things that needed to happen in this room. Thank you, she said. Serath looked at her with his steady eyes and nodded once. Then he looked at Aurelion, and back at Morel, and at the open ceiling panels, and at the space where the tree had been, and made the quiet assessment of a man adding up a sum that he hadn't been given all the variables for, and deciding he had enough to proceed. I need to see my sisters, he said. He left. Corin looked at both of them with the expression of a man whose job description had not adequately prepared him for this morning, and followed. The doors closed. The throne room was empty except for Morel and Aurelion and the silence between them, which had the quality of a silence that had been waiting a long time for its moment and was now fully present in it. She turned to look at him. He was looking at his own hands. The tremor had not stopped. If anything, it had deepened slightly, the body's evidence of what it meant to be whole after 300 years of being split. Not pain, exactly, or not only pain, but the specific quality of a system coming back online that had been running at partial capacity for so long that full capacity felt overwhelming and strange and almost unbearable in its completeness. "How bad is it?" she said. He looked up. Something crossed his face, a surprised quality, as though he'd expected the first thing out of her mouth after the doors closed to be something else entirely. "Manageable," he said. "That's not what I asked." A breath. "Strange," he said. "It feels... I have been partial for so long that whole feels like too much room. Like a house you've lived in for years suddenly having all its walls pushed outward. The space is correct. It takes time to believe you deserve it." She understood that. She held the document in her hands and looked at him across the throne room floor and understood it from the inside out. The specific disorientation of something you've been hungry for arriving and finding you've forgotten how to be not hungry. She'd been living in the arithmetic of survival for so long that the document in her hands felt, in this moment, less like an answer than like the removal of a load she'd been carrying so long she'd built her posture around it. Who are you when the thing that was defining you by its absence is suddenly present? That was the question at the bottom of both of them, she thought. That was the question under the centuries and the trials and the grove and the severed arrangement and the dissolved gold. Not what do you want, though that was part of it, but who are you when you are no longer defined by what you don't have? She walked toward him, not quickly. The deliberate pace of someone who has decided to do something and is giving the decision the full weight of its own movement rather than rushing past the significance of it. She stopped 3 feet from him and looked at his face up close, the way she hadn't allowed herself to look in Noctur, where there had always been something else to track. The trials, the grove, the contract, the arrangement, the exit strategy. Now there was nothing else to track. The room was empty. The work was done. The document was in her hands and the gold was dissolved, and the 6 princesses were waking in their chambers above with their slippers ruined for the last time. She looked at Aurelian Vey with the same eyes she'd brought to everything else. No softening, no distance, no filter of the things she needed to accomplish first. Just him, fully present, with the tremor in his hands and the fullness of 300 years restored to his face, and something in his eyes that was not hope exactly, but was hope's precursor. The state of a person who has stopped believing something is possible, and then encountered evidence that their belief was wrong, and is now in the terrifying space between old certainty and new uncertainty. "I left through the East Passage," she said, "not the door in the clearing." "I know," he said. "That means the door is still there." "Yes," he said. "Which means the question you asked me in the clearing is still unanswered." He was very still. The tremor in his hands had quieted. "I know that too," he said. She looked at him. "There is a particular courage required to want something you have no framework for. Not the courage of battle or endurance or the willingness to absorb damage. Those are real, but they are navigable. They have forms and shapes that you can prepare for. The courage of wanting something that falls entirely outside the categories of what you've been permitted to want is different. It requires you to hold the wanting without the structure of precedent, without the safety of knowing how it goes, without any of the maps that experience usually provides. Morel Thorne had never been permitted to want most things. She had spent 21 years negotiating her wants down to the achievable, the safe, the least expensive thing to admit to. Not because she was small, but because small was what had been available, and she was a pragmatist. Had been a pragmatist by necessity since she was 14 years old, standing at the edge of a village with a pack on her back, and the understanding that the universe had just massively revised its terms. The document in her hands was the end of that negotiation. She could want the larger thing now. She could say so. "I'm not staying in Noctur as it was," she said. "What it was is 300 years of a man running a kingdom alone until the running of it replaced everything else. I'm not stepping into that shape." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" He looked at her for a moment with the new fullness of his eyes, the reunion restored depth of them. "I'm asking whether you would be willing to be present while we figure out what the shape is," he said. "Not the old Noctur, not a throne beside mine in the form it's been. Something neither of us has a map for." A pause. "You said in the 3rd trial that you wanted to exist somewhere you weren't provisional. I'm not offering you permanence in the sense of stasis. I'm offering you settle, but..." He stopped, found the word. Permanence in the sense of being chosen, every day, without the choice expiring. The throne room was very quiet. The sea outside the open ceiling panels threw its sound against the black cliffs, steady and indifferent and present. The same sound it had been making against these cliffs for longer than any empire or arrangement or golden prison. She thought about what it meant, not the romantic architecture of it. She had no patience for the romantic architecture, and he knew that the trials had shown him exactly what she was made of, and it was not the material that was moved by grand gestures. She thought about what it actually meant, in the practical and honest sense of daily reality. It meant Nocthur needed to change. The kingdom that had been shaped by 300 years of solitary sovereignty, that had developed the particular distortions of a place run by someone who had stopped being accountable to anyone, could not remain what it was. The grove had existed because there had been no one to say it shouldn't. The 7 people in the trees had happened because there had been no external check on the decision. She had been the first person in 2 centuries to push back, and the pushing back had mattered, which meant the pushing back needed to be structural rather than incidental. That was what she would be, not decorative, not a companion piece to his authority, not a trophy of the thing he'd been waiting for. The actual check, the actual counterweight, the person who would look at him when he was about to put someone in a tree and say no and mean it and have the standing to make it matter. He knew all of this. She could see him knowing it. The trials had not been one-directional. In showing Nocthur who she was, they had also shown her who he was, and what he was asking for was not a person who would soften the edges of his sovereignty. He was asking for a person who would hold him accountable to the version of himself that had argued plainly at the river and confessed the grove and asked without leverage. That, she thought, was what 300 years of isolation produced when it finally cracked open honestly. Not the desire to be unchallenged, but the desire to be seen. The things that break people are rarely what they look like from the outside. The disasters that produce visible wounds, exile, imprisonment, violence, are survivable precisely because they are external and named and fought with the body and the will. The disasters that hollow people out are the invisible ones, the long removal of the need to be accountable, the slow replacement of relationship with management, the gradual substitution of dominion for connection until the sovereign wakes one day inside a perfectly running kingdom that has not needed anything real from him in centuries and understands, too late or just in time depending on who comes through the door, that they have built a beautiful prison out of their own power. She held the document in one hand. She held his gaze with the other. "I'm going to need things from you," she said, "not as tribute, as the minimum requirement of anyone who is a genuine partner rather than a subject." "Yes," he said, "the 7 people in the grove, they need to go home. Whatever home means for them now, given the time that's passed. That's the first thing." "Yes." Nocthur's relationship with the mortal world above it gets renegotiated from the beginning. Not the arrangement that your predecessor and mine constructed. Something new. Something both sides actually consent to. "Yes." "And when you are about to make a decision that costs someone who isn't in the room," she said, "you tell me first. Not ask my permission. Tell me. So there is a witness. So the decision doesn't happen in the dark where no one can question it." He looked at her. Something in his face moved through several things in quick succession. The sovereign's instinct to qualify, to preserve space, to maintain the architecture of unilateral authority, and came out the other side of all of them into something simpler and more real. "Yes," he said. She nodded once. Then she crossed the remaining distance between them and put her hand against the side of his face, not gently and not roughly, but with the honest directness of someone who has decided to do a thing and is doing it without ceremony, and looked at him up close with her red eyes open and her worn coat and her rough-knuckled hands and the 21 years of being the thing the world made wrong without her consent and without her permission. He looked back at her, not at the mark, not at the red in the iris that had been the occasion for her exile and her wandering in every village that had run her out with torches and dogs and the arithmetic of human fear dressed up as righteousness. He looked at her, the full composite of everything she was, and the look had no reservation in it, no asterisk, no fine print that said this acceptance was contingent on her performing harmlessness. She was seen, not managed, not tolerated, not permitted to exist until the permission ran out. Seen. This is what 21 years of exile teaches you about the thing you most need. You don't recognize it when it arrives by the warmth of it. You recognize it by the absence of the cold that has been present so long, you stopped noticing it as cold and started experiencing it as the natural temperature of existing. The cold stopped. She did not weep. She had no tears for this, which was not because she felt nothing, but because she felt something larger than tears, something that required the stillness of her whole body to hold correctly. She lowered her hand. "The door in the clearing," she said. "Does it work from the outside?" "No," he said. "Only from Noctur's side." "Then we need a passage," she said. "A real one. Not the original arrangement's passage, not the sealed East Foundation. A new one. Something that goes both directions and stays open and is ours." "I can build that," he said. "It will take time, a few weeks." "Then we have a few weeks," she said. She turned and looked at the space where the tree had been, the square of empty floor, the pale ghost of 3 centuries of presence now resolved into absence. The throne room around it continued to be a throne room, stone and iron, and the vaulted ceiling open to the coastal sky, the salt air coming in through the panels. An empire's seat of power, and in the middle of it, a gap where the longest-standing lie had finally told the truth. She thought about what Sarath would do with it. A king who had just discovered his empire's military legacy was built on a debt paid by his sisters' bodies, generation after generation, for 30 years of victories 300 years ago. That arithmetic ran in a specific direction, and the direction was not comfortable. The emperor's clothes, the histories called it sometimes, the things a ruling class refuses to look at directly, because the looking would require a reckoning with what was done to make the comfort possible. Sarath was not a comfortable man. She'd read that from the first day. He was a sharp man, a capable man, a man who had built genuine governance over 15 years through the combination of discipline and the willingness to make hard decisions. Whether he was the kind of man who could extend that discipline to his own inheritance remained to be seen. She thought she knew the answer. She thought the way he'd said, "my sisters," the weight of the words, the crack in the sovereign architecture that he'd allowed himself briefly in her presence. She thought that was the answer. He would look at it. He would not be comfortable, but he would look. "I need to go back down," she said, "to the East Passage. The 7 people, I'll go with you," Aurelion said. She looked at him. "They've been in my grove for periods ranging from 40 to 200 years, he said. "They're my responsibility. I should be present when they're told what's available to them." She noted the word responsibility, filed it in the place where she kept the things that told her what a person actually was, as distinct from what they performed being. "All right," she said. They left the throne room together. Corin was in the corridor, back at his post, with the expression of a man who had made peace with the fact that his job was not going to be fully explicable for the foreseeable future. He looked at the 2 of them, and then very deliberately looked at the middle distance. "The king is with his sisters," he said. "Good," Morel said. She moved down the corridor with Aurelion beside her, not behind, not in front, beside. And this small geometry was its own statement, the spatial grammar of 2 people who were figuring out what beside meant and had committed to figuring it out honestly. The 7 people were waiting in the garden. Someone, possibly Corin, possibly one of the sympathetic junior guards, had brought blankets and food, and the 7 of them were sitting or standing in the early morning light with the specific quality of people who had been inside something dark for a very long time and were currently recalibrating their relationship with the concept of direct sunlight. The woman from the second trial was standing apart from the others, near the seawall, looking at the sea with the expression of someone who has just discovered that 40 years is both an immense amount of time and a survivable amount of time, and is working out the ratio between those 2 facts. Morel walked to her. The woman turned. Up close, in morning light rather than the trial room's single candle, she was younger looking than the tree impression had suggested. The preservation had not aged her, had held her at the moment of her capture, and she was perhaps 28 in the body, which made the 40 years in her eyes a particular kind of disorientation. "You came back up," the woman said. "I said I would." "People say things." "I know," Morel said. "I've been on the receiving end of people saying things and then not doing them for 21 years. It's why I try to only say what I'm going to do." The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Aurelian, who had stopped a few feet back and was standing with his hands at his sides. The new fullness of his presence, evident even in stillness. Something moved across the woman's face that was more complicated than any single word could hold. The collision of 40 years of preserved anger and the recognition that the anger was legitimate and also that the thing had ended and the person who ended it was standing here in a coat held together with salvaged cord, having apparently also negotiated something entirely different with the same sovereign who had kept her in gold bark for 4 decades. "Will Noctur become something different?" the woman said. Not to Morel, to Aurelian. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Not immediately. Not completely, but in the direction of different from this point forward, with accountability to someone who will not accept the alternatives." A pause. "I'm aware that is not sufficient reparation for 40 years. "No," the woman said. "It isn't." "I know," he said. She looked at him for a long time. The sea moved behind her, indifferent and present. "My family," she said. "The bloodline I came down for." "The arrangement is severed," Morel said. "Whatever was happening to your family's line ends with the severance." The woman closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the anger was still there, but something else had moved into the front of it, something more worn and more honest. The relief of someone who has been holding a wound open by sheer determined attention, waiting for the moment it was safe to let it close. "Where do I go?" she said. 40 years. Everyone I knew is dead or old." Morel held her gaze. "The Empire has more provinces than you've seen," she said. "The documentation I carry can be used to establish new identity for people who need it, not forgery. The king owes a debt, and he knows it. A debt to everyone in that grove. New papers, new standing, new starting point." The woman looked at her. "You negotiated that," she said. "I'm negotiating it right now," Morel said. "But Sarath Draven is a man who pays what he owes when it's put in front of him clearly. I'll put it in front of him clearly." Something happened on the woman's face that was finally the thing that had been under all the other things for 40 years. Not happiness. Happiness was too simple a word for what it was. The specific quality of a person who has been surviving in the direction of a thing for so long that arriving at it requires a moment of complete stillness before the next motion is possible. She nodded once. "All right," she said. The sun was fully up by the time Morel went back inside. She found Sarath in the corridor outside his sister's chambers, not inside them, sitting on the stone bench that lined the passage wall with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded and his face in the particular configuration of a man who has just spent an hour with the 6 people most important to him in the world and has come out into the corridor to process what that hour cost him. She sat down on the bench beside him. Not at a diplomatic distance, close, the way you sit next to someone when you are not performing comfort but actually offering presence. He did not look up immediately. "Aaron was still asleep when I got there," he said. "The others were awake. Lero looked at me for about 30 seconds and then said something that I'm going to be thinking about for the rest of my life." A pause. She said she'd been aware the whole time that something was wrong, and she'd never said it directly because she didn't want to be the one who broke the version of this place that still felt safe. He was quiet. "My sisters have been performing safety for me for 6 weeks because they were afraid of what my face would do if they told me they were scared." Morel said nothing. Let it sit. "That's a failure of governance," he said. "Not the arrangement, not the 300-year debt. The 6 weeks of my sisters not telling me they were frightened because my throne room is not a place where fear is a thing you can say out loud without consequences." "Yes," she said. "You said it out loud," he said, "on the first day. You told me your conditions and made me state mine and negotiated in front of my court without apology." He looked at her sideways. "I've been thinking about why that worked." "Because I had nothing to lose," she said, which is a different kind of leverage than anything you can buy or threaten. You can't make someone afraid of losing something they've never been allowed to have. He looked at her for a long moment. "The Empire owes you more than a document," he said. "The Empire owes a lot of people more than they've been given," she said. "Start with the 7 in the garden. They need papers and starting points and the official acknowledgement that what happened to them was the Empire's inherited debt and not their failure. Do that, and we'll call the rest of it a conversation for another day. Sarath looked at the corridor floor, looked at his folded hands. The sovereign of Nocther, he said. He's staying. For the time being, she said, while we build what comes next. And you, he said. She looked at the corridor wall, at the stone that had been here for centuries, absorbing the specific weight of every conversation that had happened in its presence, all the fear and ambition and love and grief and calculation that had moved through the people who had walked these passages. I'm going to need an office, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time since she had met him, Sareth Draven made a sound that was not the sovereign and not the brother, and not the king at the edge of a difficult decision. It was a small, exhaled sound, somewhere between a breath and a laugh, the specific sound of a person who has been in an impossible situation for a very long time and has just found one thing about it that is not impossible. I'll have Corin find you one, he said. She nodded. They sat on the stone bench in the corridor outside the chambers where 6 women were sleeping their first uncompelled sleep in 6 weeks, and the morning moved around them with the indifference of mornings, and the sea outside the walls did what the sea had always done, and the empire continued to be the empire, complex and imperfect and full of debts, both settled and outstanding. Morel folded the document in her hands, tucked it inside her coat against her ribs, where it sat with the specific warmth of something that had been waited for long enough that the waiting had become load-bearing and was now, carefully, being set down. The red in her eyes was the same as it had always been. The mark was unchanged. But the face around it was different in the way that faces are different when the story they've been carrying for 21 years has finally reached its resolution. Not erased, not softened, but settled. The way stone settles when the structure built on top of it has found its final form and the pressure is no longer redistributing but simply bearing weight as it was designed to do. She had not become something else. She had become more fully what she had always been, which is the only true form of transformation. Not the shedding of the self, but the arrival at the self, after the long road through everything the world puts between a person and the honest fact of who they are. Below the palace, the east passage waited in its stone. In the garden, 7 people held their faces toward the sun. In the throne room, the space where the tree had been was just a space now, clean and present, waiting for whatever would be built in it next. And in the corridor of an empire that was, quietly, in the process of reckoning with what it had been built on top of, 2 people sat with the morning and said nothing for a while, which was its own kind of beginning. The crowns that last are not the ones taken by force. They are not the ones inherited by accident of blood. They are the ones earned in the hardest currency available, the willingness to look at the full cost of power and carry it forward anyway, not because you're strong enough to hold it alone, but because you found someone willing to hold it with you, and both of you understand, without needing to say it, that the weight shared honestly is not the same weight at all. Morel Thorne had walked into this empire with a cursed face and a bargain and 21 years of nothing left to lose. She left it with a name, a document, a direction, and a choice she had made with her eyes open. It was enough. It was, for the first time in a very long time, more than enough.